Hey guys, tonight we're slipping beneath the chalkboard genius to uncover the tangled, polyamorous life of Albert Einstein. Spoiler alert. You probably won't survive this. Emotionally. It's not all the MC2 and heartwarming violin serenades. This is the story of one of history's most celebrated minds, and the many women who revolved around his personal orbit like confused satellites. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop a comment with your city and what time you're listening. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a cobbled street in Zurich around 1900. The air smells like ink, pipe smoke, and half-finished pastries. Inside a cramped apartment, Einstein is still young, not yet the wild-haired oracle of physics, but already full of fire. He's got this scrappy kind of brilliance that makes his professors uncomfortable, and his classmates intrigued. One of those classmates is Mileva Maric, a brilliant physicist in her own right, and the only woman in his class. From the very beginning, their connection buzzes like static electricity. They study together, argue about thermodynamics, and slowly, inevitably fall into something like love. It's real, passionate, intellectual, and, as always with Alba, messy. You slip inside their apartment, and it's chaos. Books stacked like leaning towers, papers everywhere, and a crying baby in the next room. They've just had their first daughter, Liesel, but nobody talks about her. Not in letters, not in family memoirs. She disappears from the record, likely adopted, or, darker theory, she may have died in infancy. Historians still argue over what happened. Some say Einstein abandoned her. Others think Mileva was forced to give her up due to the shame of an out-of-wedlock birth. Whatever the truth, it leaves a permanent bruise on their relationship. By the time they marry in 2003, cracks are already showing. Albert is chasing his academic dreams, and Mileva is losing herself in housework, motherhood, and disappointment. She had hoped to be his partner in science, but he drifts further and further into solitary work. Eventually, she's not even allowed to read his drafts. And then comes the affair. Several, actually, but one stands out. Elsa. Not just a lover. His cousin. Yep. Welcome to Einstein's inner web of awkward family dinners. By 1912, Albert's already involved with Elsa Löwenthal, even while still married to Mileva. The two women's lives overlap for years, one caring for his children, the other warming his bed and feeding his ego. Letters from this time show Albert writing to Elsa about his feelings for her, while simultaneously depending on Mileva to keep his household from crumbling. It's not just physical betrayal, it's emotional outsourcing. Elsa is soft and nurturing, an escape from Mileva's sharp intellect and growing bitterness. But even Elsa isn't the final stop on this romantic train. Eventually, Einstein offers Mileva a divorce with, let's say, conditions. One of the strangest facts in Einstein's biography is the deal he makes. He promises her the money from his future Nobel Prize if she agrees to divorce him. This, of course, assumes he's going to win one. It's the most confident prenup history's ever seen. But Mileva accepts. She's broke, raising two boys alone, and still strangely loyal. Albert goes on to win the Nobel in 1921, and to his credit, he honours the deal. The money goes to Mileva. The marriage, though, is long dead. Now with Elsa full-time, Einstein begins what you might call his polycurious phase. While publicly living as a devoted husband, privately he's developing a kind of rotating romantic roster. A notebook from the 1920s lists the names of 6 women he's involved with, some brief, some serious. At one point, he's writing to a lover in Berlin while on vacation, with another in Paris. Elsa knows. She's not happy, but she looks the other way. She might have seen this coming. You're sipping coffee across from them at breakfast in their Berlin apartment. Elsa pours tea with that long-suffering spouse energy, while Albert flips through a newspaper and occasionally smirks. It's the 1920s, and he's famous now. Icon level, Time magazine cover. People are naming their dogs after him. He uses this new attention to his advantage, charming women at lectures, parties, even on trains. His letters to them are tender, flirtatious, sometimes poetic, but rarely faithful. One fringe theory that scholars debate: did Einstein see love as a kind of scientific curiosity? His writings on emotional connection sometimes sound clinical, like he's dissecting affection under a microscope. Some argue he was experimenting with relationships the way he experimented with time and space. Others think that's giving him way too much credit, that he was just a genius with an ego and a wandering eye. After Elsa dies in 1936, Albert never remarries, but he doesn't live alone. He brings in a distant cousin, Margot, to manage his house, and also a secretary, Helen Ducas. The arrangement has a weird energy. No romance, at least officially, but definitely codependence. Ducas handles his schedule, shields him from fans, and becomes the gatekeeper to Einstein's life. Some speculate he preferred these layered, non-traditional households, where emotional needs were met by multiple people and no one person had all the responsibility. Late in life, his letters soften. You watch him in his Princeton study, older now, hair fully untamed, slippers by the fire. He writes to multiple women, some from decades earlier. The passion is gentler, tinged with regret. He speaks of the hunger of the heart and his failures as a husband. There's one line, scratched out and rewritten, that sticks with you. To understand the universe is simple compared to understanding love. It's easy to see Albert Einstein as the brain on a pedestal, but his life, like his theories, is full of relativity. Time and space, yes, but also loyalty and love, passion and betrayal. He was a man who needed many women for many different reasons, but never quite learned how to hold on to one without letting the others slip through his fingers. Genius! Absolutely, but even a genius can be lost in the chaos of the human heart. You find yourself in the flickering glow of a dim hotel corridor in Manhattan, 1943. The war is on, and a strange figure glides past the elevators like a ghost in a tailored suit. He moves quickly as if he's always on the brink of vanishing. You follow the glint of polished shoes and a cane, not for support but style, until you arrive at a quiet door with a heavy silence behind it. Inside sits Nikola Tesla, the eccentric inventor, alone, surrounded by coils, notes, and shadows. No wife, no lover, no scandal, at least not in the way you'd expect. But the absence of a traditional love life doesn't mean Tesla lived in emotional emptiness. Quite the opposite. The man was filled to the brim with devotion. It just wasn't directed at people. You take a seat in the corner of the room, careful not to disturb the arrangement of mechanical parts spread across the floor like a ritual. Tesla doesn't notice you. He's talking to a pigeon. Yes, a pigeon. And this isn't some metaphor. This was a very real, very public part of Tesla's later years. He claimed to be in love with a specific white pigeon who visited him daily. "I love that pigeon as a man loves a woman," he once said. Not joking, dead serious. He described her eyes, her wings, the glowing light he swore he saw the moment she died. And he mourned her like a widow. Some historians write this off as madness. Others see it as something deeper. A man who gave all his passion to work and found comfort in something pure, uncomplicated, and heartbreakingly one-sided. Go back a few decades and Tesla is a handsome man in his prime, over 6 feet tall, chiseled features, European accent, always in a tuxedo. Women adored him. Journalists described him as magnetic, not just intellectually but physically. Yet he turned them all away. Every time. It wasn't shyness, it wasn't naivety. Tesla deliberately rejected romantic relationships. Publicly, he said marriage would interfere with his work. Privately, there are hints of a more complex worldview. He once said he believed that celibacy helped him maintain his intellectual clarity. But then again, he also thought he was communicating with Martians via radio signals. So take it all with a grain of salt and a bolt of lightning. The quirky fact here is not just the pigeon, it's that Tesla had what can only be called an anti-love philosophy. He believed that men lost their creative edge once they gave in to desire, and he didn't just say it once in passing. This was a recurring theme in his writings and interviews. He spoke often of his disappointment in how women had overstepped their traditional roles, claiming that the modern woman wanted to compete with men instead of inspire them. It's a controversial view, obviously, and scholars still argue over whether it reflects personal bitterness, social conservatism, or something else entirely. Was he a man betrayed by a lover we never knew about? Or was he simply someone who saw romantic entanglement as noise in the symphony of invention? And yet Tesla wasn't cold, far from it. His letters are passionate, just not romantic. When he writes about electricity or about the future of wireless communication, his words practically blush on the page. He wrote with awe, wonder, and borderline obsession. His deep friendships, particularly with financiers like J.P. Morgan's daughter Anne, have been scrutinized for romantic undertones, but there's no clear evidence. There's always something missing, something he's holding back. You get the sense that Tesla wasn't emotionally numb, he was emotionally rerouted, the kind of person who falls in love with ideas instead of people. One lesser-known theory, quietly debated among a few scholars, is that Tesla may have been asexual, or even aromantic, long before those terms had any cultural recognition. It's not just that he didn't pursue relationships, it's that he actively seemed repelled by the idea of intimacy. Some biographers suggest he may have experienced trauma or deep anxiety around sex. Others argue he may have had neurodivergent traits that made emotional intimacy more difficult to access in the traditional sense. He didn't relate to people the way most do, and didn't pretend to. You wander with him through the halls of the Wardenclyffe Tower in Long Island, where he once dreamed of free wireless power for the entire world. The tower is half finished, humming with eerie silence. He poured every cent he had into it, and it failed spectacularly. And yet he never regretted the gamble. Love for Tesla was faith in the future, a boundless, hopeless, radiant belief that one day the world would catch up to his vision. He couldn't share a bed, but he would have shared the stars. Later, in his final years, the reclusive inventor lived in a hotel room funded by benefactors who viewed him as more myth than man. His life became a blur of routines: walks to feed pigeons, long conversations with chambermaids about energy fields, and occasional public lectures where his eyes would light up with that old femme. But always, he returned to that pigeon. When she died, perhaps of natural causes, perhaps because of the pollution outside the window he kept open for her, he claimed that a part of him died too. Something went out of my life, he said. Something I cannot explain. Tesla's story might seem like the outlier in this collection of passionate entanglements and polyamorous mischief, but that's exactly why it matters. His was a love story without human lovers, a romantic epic that never touched another soul's skin, and yet it's still soaked in longing, loneliness, and wonder. What do you call someone who loved too much but not anyone? Who gave everything to the invisible and intangible? As you leave his room and walk back into the night, you hear the soft coo of pigeons overhead. It's not romantic in the usual sense, but it's not lonely either. It's something stranger, and maybe, in its own way, just as powerful as any grand affair. You blink, and the electric hum of Tesla's towers fades into the earthy hush of Renaissance Florence. Stone streets wind beneath your feet, the scent of warm olive oil and pigment-heavy paint drifting from an open workshop window. It's the late 15th century, and inside that sun-split studio stands a man who looks too perfect to be real. Sharp cheekbones, contemplative gaze, robes dusted with charcoal smudges. Leonardo da Vinci doesn't notice you watching. He's too deep in the contours of a young man's shoulder, not in a painting yet, but in real life. The subject is standing there half-draped, holding a pose that walks the line between sacred and sensual. This isn't just art, it's intimacy, and it's not a rare moment. It's the quiet rhythm of Leonardo's life. You've always heard the name Da Vinci and thought genius, painter of the Last Supper, inventor of things the world wouldn't catch up to for centuries. But behind those grand canvases and flying machine sketches lies a life shaped by passion, often unspoken, often forbidden, and almost always involving beautiful men. Unlike some of the other historical figures we're exploring, Leonardo didn't leave behind juicy love letters or obvious confessions. Instead, he left traces, sketches, coded notebooks, uncomfortably affectionate dedications, and a string of relationships that made the Florentine elite raise eyebrows behind fans and goblets of wine. The first real clue arrives when Leonardo is just 24. You're standing outside the Podestar's office in 1476, watching a citywide scandal flicker to life. Leonardo and 3 other men, none of them nobility, are anonymously accused of sodomy with a young male prostitute named Jacopo Saltarelli. In Renaissance Florence, this wasn't just frowned upon, it was criminal. If convicted, it could mean imprisonment or worse. The case is quietly dismissed, twice, but the damage is done. Leonardo becomes hyper-aware of public perception. From this point forward, he never marries, never publicly discusses romantic attachments, and buries his heart deep inside sketchbooks no one will read until centuries later. But he still surrounds himself with young men, particularly apprentices. You hover beside him as he mentors Gian Giacomo Caprotti, a boy he nicknames Salai, which charmingly translates to Little Devil. Salai is trouble, stealing money, wrecking projects and sparking general chaos wherever he goes. But Leonardo keeps him close for over 2 decades. Salai appears again and again in Leonardo's art, often as a model for angels, mythological figures, or soft, ambiguous faces that suggest something more than artistic interest. Scholars still debate the nature of their relationship. Was it romantic, sexual, just complicated? One thing's clear, Leonardo kept Salai by his side longer than almost anyone else in his life. That's not nothing. Now, fast forward to Milan. You're sitting beside Leonardo as he works on the ceiling of the Sala delle Asse, humming to himself in soft Latin. Another figure flits in and out of the studio. Francesco Melzi, a nobleman's son with long lashes and a serious work ethic. Melzi becomes Leonardo's intellectual heir, confidant, and something else. Their letters are full of tenderness and admiration. Leonardo refers to Francesco as his beloved son, and Francesco calls him my dear father. It sounds formal until you read between the lines. The language is carefully coded, but the warmth is there. After Leonardo's death, it's Melzi who inherits the bulk of his estate. Not Salai, not any blood relatives. It's hard not to read that as a kind of final love letter. Now, the fringe theory. Some believe Leonardo may have considered himself what we'd now call queer, but perhaps not in a way defined strictly by desire. There's an argument that he saw human bodies, and especially male bodies, as divine, as something that transcended mere lust. His anatomical sketches, his mythological male nudes, even his obsession with ideal proportions all point to a man who revered form and physicality. Not to sexualize necessarily, but to worship in. Was this love? Was it art? Maybe both. Maybe neither. That's the tension historians still wrestle with. Meanwhile, he paints the Mona Lisa, which you were probably wondering about. The woman with the world's most mysterious smile. Some say it's based on Lisa Gherardini, a merchant's wife. Others say it's Salai in drag. Seriously. There's evidence Leonardo painted at least one male version of the Mona Lisa, nicknamed Monna Vanna, which adds even more fuel to that fire. Was he playing with gender? Was he amused by how identity could shift depending on brushstroke and angle? Or was he quietly expressing the things he couldn't say aloud? You follow Leonardo to the French countryside in his final years, where he lives in quiet luxury, still sketching until his hands tremble. Francesco Melzi is with him to the very end. On his deathbed, Leonardo requests a priest, not out of sudden guilt, but out of cultural routine. Even geniuses hedge their bets. He dies surrounded by notes, tools, and memories shall be half preserved in parchment. The church later tries to whitewash his life, focusing on his virtuous accomplishments, but they can't erase what he left behind. The coded drawings, the friendships, the rumours, the gaps filled with longing. Modern scholars argue fiercely over Leonardo's orientation. Some insist he was celibate. Others believe he lived a quietly gay life, carefully hidden behind veils of ambiguity. Still others argue for a broader label, someone whose love defied category. In his notebooks he writes that the soul of man can be found in motion, in form, in symmetry. Maybe that's where he located desire, not in the chaos of the body, but in the elegance of its possibilities. As the bells of Florence toll the hour, you step back from his world. It was never loud and never scandalous like Byron or Wilde. It whispered. It hid in shadows, in angles of light, in the curve of a lip or the subtlety of a hand. But it was there, undeniably, pulsing beneath the surface of the Renaissance's greatest mind. Da Vinci, the thinker, the painter, the dreamer, perhaps also the lover, in his own hidden, complicated way. The scent of wet paint and tequila clings to the air as you find yourself inside a sun-drenched courtyard in Coyoacan, Mexico. Bougainvillea spill down adobe walls. There's laughter in one room, shouting in another, and a record crackling something half joyful, half sad in the background. You step carefully over a sleeping dog and a pair of discarded paintbrushes. This is La Casa Azul, the Blue House, and tonight it holds the burning, volatile, endlessly fascinating love life of Frida Kahlo. It's not a story of quiet longing or hidden affairs. This is love as revolution, messy, colourful, angry, and defiantly open. You're not stepping into a marriage, you're stepping into a battlefield. And somehow it's the same thing. Frida sits near the window in a hand-embroidered dress, her hair twisted with ribbon, cigarette dangling from her fingers. She's already watching you, as if she knows you're here to snoop. Be honest, her eyes say. You didn't think a woman in her corset and eyebrows like mine could handle more than one lover, did you? And she'd be right. Frida didn't just handle multiple lovers, she orchestrated them, she painted them, she wept over them. She made her entire existence a kind of open-air diary of passion, rage, and brutal honesty. And she did it while physically shattered. Let's be real, Frida was dealt a rough hand. Childhood polio left her with one leg thinner than the other. Then came the infamous bus crash at 18, her spine, pelvis, and legs smashed like porcelain. And yet, even in the hospital bed, she painted. Her art wasn't just her outlet, it was her declaration. Her relationships? Same energy. She didn't have time for social expectations. If love came, she let it in. If it burned her, she painted the scars. The most famous name tangled in her story is Diego Rivera, the muralist with a genius for colour and a disaster streak in love. He was large in size, fame and ego. When they were married in 1929, she was 22 and he was 43. Everyone said it was doomed. And they were right, and also wrong, because the doom was the point. They didn't try to build a conventional marriage. They built something weirder, more elastic. A union that bent and broke and bent again, held together by mutual obsession, infidelity, and, believe it or not, honest negotiation. Frida had lovers, many, and of every gender, from the photographer Tina Modotti to famed singer Chavela Vargas to Josephine Baker. Yes, that Josephine Baker. And then there was Leon Trotsky. Yep, the exiled Russian revolutionary. He crashes on Frida's couch during one of his more dangerous exiles and winds up in her bed, in the very house Diego built. The affair is brief, explosive, and ends with awkward silence, especially when Diego finds out. But here's the twist. Diego also had affairs, constantly, with actresses, models, friends of Frida's, once even her sister. It sounds like a disaster, and it is, but it's also surprisingly designed. Frida and Diego had an agreement, essentially an open marriage. But it wasn't some cool, detached, do-what-you-want arrangement. It was high drama, table-flipping, poem-writing chaos. They fought constantly, broke up, got divorced, and then remarried. You could call it toxic, sure, but they also wrote letters to each other like lovers in a romantic epic. In one, Diego calls her my little dove, and in another, Frida says, "You deserve a lover who takes away the lies and brings you hope, coffee, and poetry." Was that each other? Not always. But sometimes, yes. Enough to keep coming back. You're walking with Frida through a crowded gallery in New York. She's wearing traditional Tijuana dress, drawing every eye, not caring one bit. Critics argue over whether she's surrealist, feminist, nationalist, or just uncategorizable. Meanwhile, she's sipping champagne and laughing with a woman who's clearly more than a friend. This is where Frida breaks every mold. She doesn't hide her affairs, she paints them. One canvas features herself between two lovers. Another shows her heart quite literally lying outside her body, bleeding on the ground. Her work isn't subtle, but neither is her life. Here's your quirky detail. Frida wrote letters to her lovers in perfumed ink. Yes, she scented her correspondence like a 19th century duchess. In one note to Chavela Vargas, she described her desire in anatomical metaphors so raw they read more like biology than poetry. There's something incredibly modern about her, centuries ahead of her time. She lived as if the rules didn't apply, and when they did, she broke them anyway. And yet the scholarly debate rages on. Was Frida a true polyamorist? Or just someone reacting to emotional trauma through tangled relationships? Some critics suggest she sought validation through love because of her chronic pain and disability. Others argue she made a conscious choice to reject monogamy as a form of control and instead reclaim her body and autonomy through sexual agency. The truth is probably both. A woman in agony, yes, but also a woman who chose to love loudly even when it cost her everything. In the later years, her body begins to collapse under the weight of injuries and illness. Surgeries pile up, she loses her leg. She becomes more fragile, more confined, but not less fierce. Even in a wheelchair, she attends her final solo exhibition in Mexico, arriving by stretcher, propped up in bed in the middle of the gallery, like the queen of pain and beauty. Diego is there. So are other lovers, and even though her marriage is frayed beyond repair, Diego remains one of the last people she writes to before she dies. Her final diary pages are soaked in longing. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. You step out into the garden, the sky wide and indifferent. Frida's life wasn't a romance. It was a revolution, painted in blood and colour and confessions. She didn't fit into any category, didn't apologise, didn't flinch. Her polyamory wasn't a theoretical lifestyle, it was an act of rebellion. Against gender, against pain, against anyone who thought love had to look a certain way. She burned, and then she painted the ashes. You're walking through a fog-laced London street, just after twilight, when the lights in a tucked-away townhouse window flicker into view. Inside, voices rise, not loud but layered, like pages being shuffled in a library. The air smells of pipe smoke and ink, and from the next room, a low, precise voice reads a passage from a novel still being written. You've just slipped into the Bloomsbury Group's inner circle, and tonight, your focus lands on Virginia Woolf. She sits cross-legged on the floor, her dress askew, one hand twirling a loose strand of hair as she half listens, half vanishes into her own head. You can already feel it, the tangle of intellect and desire that defines her secret life, her open marriage, and her many, many quietly smouldering loves. Virginia isn't the kind of woman who announces her affairs with a dramatic flourish. She doesn't storm out of drawing rooms or scrawl bitter letters in perfume-stained ink. Instead, she writes. She lets her longing seep through paragraphs, lace itself between metaphors, and hide under the comma of an otherwise innocent sentence. But make no mistake, her heart is in a constant quiet rebellion. Her marriage to Leonard Woolf is real, even tender, but it's not exclusive, not emotionally, not romantically, and certainly not sexually. Leonard understands this. He loves her, but he also gives her the space to drift, to fall into other people like fog on glass. You see it most clearly with Vita Sackville-West. The moment they meet, something electric charges the air. Like the start of a storm neither of them intends to stop. Vita is everything Virginia isn't, tall, flamboyant, self-assured, practically dripping with aristocratic confidence. She's also already married to a man, Harold Nicholson, who incidentally has his own relationships with men. It's like a polyamorous web spun in tweed and sonnets. Vita and Virginia begin with letters, then lunches, then long weekend trips where the line between flirtation and devotion disappears completely. The Bloomsbury Group watches from the sidelines, sipping wine and taking notes for their next novels. Virginia writes Orlando for Vita. Not inspired by For, the entire novel is a shape-shifting love letter that follows a character who lives for centuries and changes gender halfway through. It's daring, romantic, and barely veiled fiction. The dedication page doesn't say much, but Virginia later admits in a letter that Orlando was Vita, only with a changeabout from one sex to another. And that right there is the pulse of Virginia's life. Fluid, poetic, resisting any single definition. You read their letters, dozens of them, pages and pages of slow-burning wit and intense affection. I am reduced to a thing that wants Virginia, Vita writes at one point. You have broken me into pieces, Virginia replies. These aren't passive friendships. These are emotional supernovas that explode gently, leaving their debris in every diary entry and published work. Vita never leaves her husband, and neither does Virginia, but their relationship endures, twisting through years like ivy, sometimes romantic, sometimes platonic, always more than either word can explain. Here's the quirky footnote. Virginia wasn't just writing about love, she was rewriting its rules. In her essay A Room of One's Own, she argues for the freedom of the female mind, for space to think, write, and exist without being defined by men. It's not a declaration of isolation, it's a manifesto of autonomy. Her life follows that script. She surrounds herself with people who reflect pieces of her. Vanessa Bell, her sister, Duncan Grant, Vanessa's lover and occasional object of affection for other group members, E.M. Forster, Lytton Strachey. The entire Bloomsbury crowd was a living experiment in chosen intimacy. Not just lovers, but co-creators of a world where love and art blur. But Virginia's story isn't all warmth and poetry, there's a heaviness too. Mental illness shadows her relationships like a curtain she can't quite pull back. She experiences breakdowns, long silences, weeks where the world feels too loud, too bright, too full of things she cannot say. Leonard becomes her anchor, gentle, patient, always near. He doesn't interfere with her love for Vita. He just stays, builds routines, buys the right paper, walks with her in the garden when everything feels like it's unraveling. Their love, while not sexual, is deeply committed. A different kind of intimacy, one that defies the traditional model of marital possession and thrives instead on trust. Scholars still debate the nature of Virginia and Leonard's marriage. Was it a convenience, a social shield, or the rare kind of bond that doesn't need a bed to be real? Some argue that Leonard's devotion to Virginia was quietly heroic, that he gave up conventional expectations to protect and nurture a brilliant, volatile spirit. Others believe Virginia settled, never quite finding the passion she truly wanted. The truth, as always, sits somewhere uncomfortable between myth and diary entry. You stand beside the river Ouse, wind rattling through the trees, as the final chapter of Virginia's life approaches. The war has returned, the world feels too broken. She writes her last letter to Leonard, pockets stones in her coat and walks into the river. It's not the end of a love story, it's the end of a life that loved deeply, too much, too many. But even in death, she leaves behind a legacy that keeps pulsing in the pages of novels, in the margins of history books, in the smudged ink of half-burned letters. Virginia Woolf didn't fit into the binary of faithful wife or reckless lover. She built her own identity with sentences and relationships that flowed like rivers, sometimes wild, sometimes still, always searching. Her polyamory wasn't defined by sexual conquest, but by emotional multiplicity. She believed a heart could hold many rooms, and in each a different kind of love waited patiently for its turn on the beach. You're gliding through candle-lit salons in 18th century Paris now, and the room smells like powdered wigs, citrus pomade, and just a hint of scandal. The air practically fizzes with flirtation, philosophical debates, and the sound of glasses clinking as powdered elites murmur about liberty, Voltaire, and, oddly enough, lightning rods. And there he is, Benjamin Franklin. No powdered wig, no flashy coat, just spectacles, charm, and a look that says he's either inventing something or planning to seduce someone, or both. You watch him navigate the crowd with effortless magnetism. Women lean in, men raise eyebrows. Franklin doesn't just belong in this room, he owns it. When you think of Ben Franklin, your mind probably jumps to bifocals, kites, and that founding father energy. But Franklin, especially during his time in France, was something else entirely. A flirt, a diplomat with a wandering eye, a man who, even in his 60s and 70s, made women giggle behind their fans. He wasn't just admired, he was desired. His hair was thinning, his body soft, but he had the one thing nobody else in the room could fake: curiosity, about science, about language, and yes, about love. Lots of it. You follow him through the opulent halls of Passy, the Paris suburb where he lived during the American Revolution. There he hosted salons filled with philosophers, socialites, and artists. But the real action wasn't in the formal dinners, it was in the side rooms, in the long walks through gardens, in the endless letters. Franklin corresponded with dozens of women, writing them witty, suggestive, and occasionally steamy letters. He wasn't subtle, he flirted like it was a second job, and while some women found it flattering, others found it exhausting. Madame Brilliant, one of his frequent companions, once joked that Franklin seemed to be in love with everyone at once. What's more fascinating is how accepted it all was. Franklin was married, technically, to Deborah Reed back in Philadelphia. But she never joined him in France. They'd been estranged for years, living separate lives. And when she died in 1774, Franklin didn't exactly mourn with monastic solitude. Instead, he leaned full tilt into what some biographers call his European bachelor phase. But bachelor doesn't quite cover it. Franklin's Paris years were a tangle of emotional entanglements and romantic diplomacy. Some historians even argue that his charm offensive helped solidify French support for the American cause. He seduced France in more ways than one. Now for the fringe detail, one of the more whispered-about names in Franklin's life is Anne-Louise Brillant de Jouy, a brilliant harpsichordist and musician who was very much married, very much younger, and very much taken with Franklin's, let's say, intellectual stamina. Their letters are filled with pet names, subtle innuendos, and long arguments about whether or not it's appropriate to kiss a friend if both parties insist it means nothing. Spoiler, it always meant something. At one point, Franklin actually suggests forming a household where they could live as platonic companions, totally innocent, of course, while still enjoying each other's company every day. It's the 18th century equivalent of, let's move in together as besties and not talk about what we're doing. Sound familiar? Another key figure is Madame Helvetius, the widow of a philosopher and a close friend of Franklin's. After Deborah's death, Franklin proposed marriage to her, not once, not twice, but multiple times. Each time she gently turned him down. But he kept visiting her home, writing to her, making her laugh. In a letter to his daughter, he once called her a woman of genius, spirit, and beauty, before sheepishly admitting she'd already rejected him again. It's easy to see this as old man desperation, but Franklin's tone is rarely pathetic. He writes about rejection with wit, like a man who understands the game and enjoys playing even if he doesn't win. Here's where the academic debate kicks in. Some scholars argue Franklin's love life was just playful, a harmless extension of his charm and quick wit. Others see it as deeper, more entangled, even manipulative. Was he leveraging intimacy to achieve political goals? Was he genuinely emotionally invested in these women? Or was he just performing the role of the American philosopher, aware of how his image added weight to his cause? What muddies the waters even more is that Franklin often blurred lines between platonic and romantic, affectionate and suggestive. He wrote to women with emotional honesty, confiding in them, praising them, even teasing them, but never quite crossing the line in public. In private, well, no one kept receipts like Instagram, so we're left piecing things together from letters and memoirs, most of which are dripping with "you had to be there" subtext. You're now sitting beside him at a candlelit table in Passy. He's got a wine glass in one hand and a fan, gifted to him by a married countess, in the other. He's telling a story about how he once tried to measure the temperature of the Gulf Stream, using nothing but a thermometer and sailor gossip. The room laughs. A woman across the table touches his hand. Her husband doesn't blink. Franklin's presence feels less like a threat and more like a shared secret. Everyone knows what's happening. No one says it aloud. There's a reason Franklin's letters and diaries from this period have become catnip for historians. They suggest not just a man of intellect, but a man of appetite, someone who believed love, flirtation, even light affairs, weren't distractions from genius, but part of the fuel. He didn't separate emotional life from public life. He used them like overlapping gears in the same machine. In his later years, back in Philadelphia, Franklin slowed down but never stopped writing to his many female friends. He reminisced about their shared jokes, complimented their intelligence, and occasionally still flirted. One of his last surviving letters is a sweet, slightly melancholy note to Madame Brilliance. It ends without closure, just a memory, a question, an echo. So was Franklin polyamorous? Technically, the term didn't exist in his time. But he lived in a way that certainly qualifies. Layered relationships, honest emotional connections with more than one person, and a complete refusal to reduce love to one shape, one role, or one life. He was a founding father who also believed in founding feelings. A man whose heart stretched across oceans, tucked between experiments and flirtations and promises he never quite made but always seemed to mean. The room smells like perfume, gunpowder and rebellion. You're backstage at a smoky Berlin cabaret in the 1930s, and the air is thick with secrets and eyeliner. Sequins catch the spotlight. Laughter rolls like thunder just beyond the curtain, and in the centre of it all, reclining in a haze of cigarette smoke and self-assurance, is Marlene Dietrich. She doesn't smile, not yet. She waits for the moment silence hits and all eyes find her. When it does, she stands. Tailored tuxedo, crimson lips, voice like a velvet blade. The crowd will see a performer. You, however, are about to witness a master of dual lives. Actor, lover, patriot, and woman whose affairs spanned gender, war zones, and entire continents. Marlene is known to history as the smoky-voiced screen siren who dazzled in The Blue Angel, who slipped effortlessly between glamour and grit. But beneath the celluloid lies a deeply polyamorous life, never officially declared, but written across decades of letters, liaisons, and carefully managed chaos. Her marriage to Rudolf Sieber lasted nearly 50 years, but if you think it was a standard love story, think again. They separated early. He preferred life away from the spotlight. She preferred sleeping with pretty much everyone in it, but they never divorced. Instead, they created what you could call a strategic marriage, one that allowed Marlene to live freely while keeping up appearances when necessary. You ride beside her on train bound for Paris, watching her carefully reapply lipstick between snatched kisses with a fellow passenger, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman. Gender didn't interest her in the way it interested everyone else. She found beauty wherever it lived. Lovers included Gary Cooper, John Gilbert, Mercedes d'Acosta, Edith Piaf, and possibly even President Kennedy. The list of alleged lovers reads like an Oscar party crossed with an MI6 roster. But this wasn't indiscriminate passion. It was curated, chosen, often deeply emotional. Marlene didn't fall in love. She collected it. One of the most intense and frequently documented relationships was with Mercedes de Acosta, a writer and socialite with a talent for falling into complicated entanglements. Mercedes, openly lesbian at a time when doing so could ruin your life, fell hard for Dietrich. Their letters, sultry, brutal, teasing, trace a relationship that burned with genuine devotion, even as Marlene kept drifting back into the arms of other lovers. And yet Mercedes tolerated it, or at least tolerated her. Because how do you cage someone like Dietrich? You don't. You follow her shadow and hope to catch some of its glow, but Marlene was also deeply practical. You watch her, decades into her Hollywood career, folding silk lingerie into a suitcase alongside a revolver. She was one of the first women in film to openly cross-dress on screen and off. Her style wasn't just fashion, it was identity defiance. Tuxedos, bowler hats, top coats. She didn't just wear men's clothes, she made them erotic. In 932, she was famously photographed kissing a woman at a party while dressed in full men's evening wear. Scandalous? Definitely. Career-ending? Not for her. She doubled down, she didn't live on the edge, she was the edge. Now here's a fringe detail not many people know. During World War II, Dietrich worked closely with the US Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. Her sultry voice wasn't just reserved for cabarets and screenplays. She recorded propaganda messages aimed at German troops, broadcasting in flawless native German, gently encouraging desertion and defiance against Hitler. She also performed for Allied troops across dangerous combat zones, often refusing the protection offered to her. In one account, she slept in tents beside wounded soldiers and sang until her voice cracked. Her lovers weren't just fellow actors, they were generals, spies, and rebels. She didn't date passively, she loved with strategy, but even among this glamour and grit, Dietrich's emotional world was a study in fragmentation. She wrote obsessively to her lovers, even when they left, especially when they left. Her letters to Ernest Hemingway read like a slow emotional striptease, part literary admiration, part sexual tension, and part longing that never quite settled. To Piaf, she wrote of loneliness. To Cooper, regret. To her daughter, Maria, she maintained a tone of maternal affection layered with sharp disapproval. Her love was often conditional, but always offered. If you entered Marlene's orbit, she made you feel like the only person in the world, until she didn't. Now the scholarly debate. Was Dietrich truly polyamorous, or was she simply a master of emotional compartmentalization? Some argue her relationships were less about connection and more about control. She held power by never giving herself completely. Others believe she was one of the first modern examples of ethical non-monogamy, practiced not as rebellion, but as authenticity. She didn't lie about her lovers. She didn't promise exclusivity. She loved freely, deeply, and most surprisingly often with the consent and awareness of those involved. And yet, with all the freedom she cultivated, Marlene wasn't immune to heartbreak. In her later years, she withdrew into a Paris apartment, living in near total seclusion. The once vibrant, untouchable icon faded behind closed blinds, her letters increasingly nostalgic. Some say she lived in regret. Others say she was simply tired of being watched, desired, needed. Her daughter wrote about visiting her in those years, finding her wrapped in silk robes, lipstick still immaculate, memories everywhere. Marlene, it seemed, couldn't stop performing, even when the audience was gone. You stand with her one last time, backstage, just before the curtain lifts. She adjusts her collar, stares into the mirror, and gives you that look. Half challenge, half invitation. Love is a habit, she once said. You have to practice it. And practice it she did, with brilliance and recklessness, sometimes kindness, sometimes cruelty, but always on her own terms. Dietrich's life wasn't about settling down or choosing one person to call home. It was about making the world her stage and filling it with the kind of love that defied scripts. Her relationships overlapped not out of confusion, but out of clarity. She wanted more than one love, and she lived in a way that made space for all of them, even if it meant living alone at the end. You're standing at the edge of a windswept cliff somewhere on the English coast, and the sea is frothing like it's trying to tell you secrets. Behind you, a horse kicks impatiently at the earth. A man, wild-haired, smirking, almost too beautiful, climbs down from the saddle with the grace of someone who knows exactly how much the world is watching him. Lord Byron, poet, scandal magnate, Walking contradiction. He's the reason your English teacher sighed and said, "Don't read the biography." And tonight, we're not just reading it, we're crawling into the margins to see what the public couldn't stop whispering about: Byron's tangled, unapologetic, and possibly incestuous web of polyamory, lust, and ruin. Byron doesn't fall in love. He plunges, head first, eyes open, consequences be damned. You meet him first as a young man, freshly famous, bathed in praise and pressed linen. He's just published Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and overnight, women are flinging themselves at him like he's the last man on earth with the decent jawline and a pocket full of dangerous metaphors. But this isn't a story of a handsome man and a few casual affairs. Byron turns love into an Olympic sport, and he trains hard. One of his most infamous relationships is with Lady Caroline Lamb, who famously described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, which, let's be honest, is exactly the kind of line that ensures someone stays famous forever. Their affair begins as electric obsession and dissolves into something that makes both parties a little unhinged. Caroline once tried to stab herself with a broken wine glass at a party to get his attention. Byron, in return, sent her a poem comparing her to a decaying corpse. Love, right? But it doesn't stop there. You move through drawing rooms and bedrooms, letters and carriages. Byron is everywhere. He sleeps with noblewomen, opera singers, men, boys, servants, basically anyone who crosses his path with enough wit or cheekbones. His letters are as bold as his exploits, sometimes tender, sometimes coldly transactional. And then there's the elephant in the room, or rather, the relative. Augusta Lee, his half-sister. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. The two grew up apart but reconnected in adulthood. Their correspondence becomes intense, intimate, loaded. In 1814, Augusta gives birth to a daughter named Medora. Byron pays for the child's expenses, writes poems for her, and refuses to discuss her paternity publicly. The scandal simmers, and though no one prints it outright, everyone knows, or thinks they know. Historians still argue over whether the relationship was sexual or just emotionally inappropriate. But when Byron later refers to himself as the grand criminal, it's hard to imagine he's talking about forgetting to return a book. Eventually, the weight of all this passion and rumour forces Byron to flee England. Officially, it's to escape debt and disgrace. Unofficially, it's because every drawing room he enters now feels like a loaded trap. You follow him to Switzerland, then Italy, then Greece, and the lovers don't stop. In Venice, he keeps a literal list of his conquests. Over 200 names in a single year, if his notes are to be believed. But it's not just body count. Byron forms genuine emotional connections. Many of his relationships overlap. Many end in heartbreak, usually for the other person. He writes letters filled with longing to one lover while entertaining another in the same house. Sometimes he falls in love with people who remind him of old lovers, sometimes with people who look like versions of himself. Here's your quirky footnote. Byron had a pet bear at university. Yes, a bear. He brought it to Cambridge because dogs were banned in student housing, and technically there was no rule against bears. This tells you everything you need to know about the man. He finds loopholes, he breaks rules, but with flair. He doesn't ask if something is acceptable, only if it's interesting. That same attitude seeps into his relationships. Why choose one lover when you can rewrite the narrative of desire entirely? Now cue the debate. Was Byron polyamorous or just compulsive? Some scholars argue that his lifestyle was less about ethical non-monogamy and more about a need to constantly feed his ego. Others, however, suggest Byron was an early example of someone who couldn't and wouldn't limit love to the structure society demanded. He didn't lie about his affairs, he didn't pretend to be faithful, he often warned lovers not to expect exclusivity, and when they did, he self-destructed or disappeared. So was he honest? Maybe too honest. Emotionally transparent in the way that burns everyone involved. You travel with him to Greece in his final years, where he fights for Greek independence and falls in love again, this time with a young soldier who may or may not have returned the feeling. Byron writes feverishly, donates his own money to the cause, and tries desperately to outrun the ghosts of his past. It doesn't work. Fever takes him before he can ever return home. He dies at 36, just 36. After hundreds of lovers, dozens of scandals, and a legacy that includes some of the greatest poetry in the English language, and also probably sleeping with his sister. Today, Byron's life is still a subject of academic ping-pong. Some see him as a cautionary tale of ego, unchecked by ethics. Others hail him as a literary rock star who lived on his own terms and dared to love with reckless transparency. And still others look at his letters and diaries and see someone who was simply too human for his time, someone whose capacity for love and ruin were inseparable. As you walk back up that cliff, the wind howls louder now. You glance back once. Byron is still standing there, wind in his shirt, smirking like he's about to do something scandalous again. And maybe he is, because Byron's story didn't end with his death. It never really ends. It just keeps being read, misread, and relived by anyone who's ever fallen in love with more than one person and refused to apologize. The sky stretches endlessly above you, soft and pale as parchment, as you hover just above the dusty fields of early 20th century Ohio. The wind smells like engine oil, wheat, and the vague excitement of something about to take off. You're here to watch a pair of brothers build the future out of wood, wire, and stubbornness. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, known to most as the inventors of powered flight, but tonight we're not looking at their wings, we're looking at what didn't take off or maybe what never had to. Their romantic lives, famously absent from public record, have long stirred quiet curiosity. Were they truly celibate geniuses, too obsessed with invention to be distracted by love, or is there something deeper behind the silence? You land beside the bicycle shop in Dayton where it all began. Inside, grease-slicked gears and paper blueprints sprawl across a cluttered table. Wilbur is hunched over a design sketch, eyebrows drawn tight, and Orville is fiddling with a copper tube that will somehow become history. Their minds hum with mechanics, wind resistance, lift equations. But what's missing from the picture is glaring. No wives, no sweethearts, no murmurs of courtship. Not even a flirtation scandal to sweeten the biographies. For two famous men who changed the world, their personal lives seem erased. Let's break that silence. Wilbur, the older brother, was known for his intensity. Brilliant, yes. Charming, occasionally, but socially distant in the extreme. After a hockey accident in his youth damaged his face and possibly his self-esteem at young, he became reclusive. He never pursued romance. In fact, he once told a reporter that he did not have time for both a wife and an airplane. That quote has become iconic, a declaration of prioritizing legacy over love. But it also raises the question, was he hiding in his work or was it simply the only place he felt safe? Orville, on the other hand, was softer around the edges, more sociable, more emotionally expressive, and even a little flamboyant in style. His friendship with Charles Lindbergh, later with his younger assistant Horace Wright, no relation, drew speculation, not just because of their closeness, but because of how carefully Orville maintained his privacy. Letters between him and certain male companions contain a level of emotional intimacy that, while not overtly romantic, has made more than a few historians squint sideways. There are no confirmed love letters, no confessed trysts, but the affectionate tone, the frequency of visits, the way Orville once described a friend's departure as a kind of heartbreak. These are not the words of someone emotionally untouched. And then there's Catherine. The Wright brothers had a sister, brilliant, outspoken and fiercely loyal, who acted as their social ambassador and intellectual equal. Catherine managed their correspondence, helped refine their public image, and often accompanied them on trips. For years the trio was inseparable. Think of them as an emotional triad, though not romantic. Catherine brought balance to the brothers' world. When Wilbur died in 1912, it shattered both surviving siblings. Orville withdrew even further, leaning on Catherine more than ever. But then something happened. Catherine, at 52, shocked Orville by marrying a fellow academic. His reaction? Fury. He cut her off entirely, refused to speak to her. Didn't attend the wedding. For nearly 2 years he pretended she didn't exist. The intensity of his response has long baffled historians. Was it about abandonment, jealousy, a deep codependency that couldn't survive being restructured? Or was it something more taboo? A possessiveness born from a displaced or buried kind of love? Here's the fringe detail. Orville may have lived in what some researchers now call a Boston marriage, a term historically used for intense platonic relationships between two same-sex people, often women, who lived together, supported one another emotionally, and occasionally shared what we'd now recognize as romantic love, even if never consummated. While there's no record of Orville formally engaging in such a union, the shape of his long-term relationships, especially with male friends he hosted for extended periods, fits the mould eerily well. One houseguest stayed for years. Another was described in family letters as his other half. Again, nothing explicit, but silence speaks. Of course, this is where academic debates fly faster than their first plane. Some scholars insist the Wright brothers were simply monastic in their devotion to aviation. That love, romance, sex, all of it, was sacrificed for the singular goal of making flight real. Others suggest that Wilbur may have been asexual, and that Orville's personal life hints at repressed or coded homosexuality. There's also the theory that their bond with Catherine was so consuming, so protective, that it precluded the need, or desire, for other emotional attachments. A kind of sibling polyamory that provided everything they needed: intimacy, purpose, stability. You watch Orville in his later years, wandering through his gardens alone. After Catherine's death, he reconnected briefly with her widower, but never really forgave the change. He lived the rest of his life quietly, avoiding the spotlight, occasionally giving interviews, but mostly reflecting. He never married. No partners ever appeared in his will, just a stack of letters, some family papers, and the echo of a house that had once been full. Were the Wright brothers celibate geniuses, or quietly polyamorous in ways history didn't, and still doesn't, quite know how to name? Maybe both, maybe neither. What's clear is that they lived outside the typical romantic narrative, and whether by choice or by circumstance, they created their own emotional architecture. Love for them didn't look like roses and rings. It looked like shared ambition, codependence, and lifelong bonds that didn't need labels to be real. As you step away from their world, the sound of an engine overhead catches your ear. You look up. A plane cuts across the sky, its wings steady, its path direct. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it flies in silence, circling just above us, unseen but undeniably there. The sea around you glows a deep wine-coloured blue, and the breeze smells like salt, thyme, and something older than memory. You've arrived on the island of Lesbos, sometime in the 6th century BCE, where the light is soft, the women are wiser than the men, and poetry floats through the air like pollen. The name Sappho has already travelled far beyond these shores, whispered in port cities and sung in temple courtyards. But here, on her home island, she's not myth. She's very real, very human. And her love life? That's the kind of layered, scandalous, and often misinterpreted epic that scholars are still arguing about 26 centuries later. You find her beneath a fig tree, reclining in loose robes, fingers smudged with ink and honey. A young woman is lying beside her, head tilted toward the sky, laughing at something Sappho just murmured. Probably a clever turn of phrase, or maybe a veiled compliment disguised as a joke. This isn't a school in the traditional sense. It's more of a creative commune, a circle of women devoted to poetry, music, and learning, and also sometimes to each other. This is where the word lesbian originates, not just geographically but emotionally. And while modern labels would have meant nothing to Sappho, the intensity of the bonds in her circle is hard to miss. Her poems, what we have of them anyway, are mosaics of longing, fragments, most of them torn by time and buried in Egyptian trash heaps, but still pulsing with desire. One describes the pain of watching a beloved marry a man. Another whispers of sleepless nights and the warm skin. He seems to me equal to the gods, she writes about a man, but it's the woman he's speaking to that haunts her. Sappho doesn't play coy. Her verses are filled with female pronouns and aching specificity. She isn't writing abstract odes to beauty. She's writing to someone, and often that someone is a woman she can't quite keep. Still, the historical debate is messier than a vase dropped in a symposium. Some scholars argue that Sappho's writing was metaphorical, artistic license, not autobiography. Others point out that male translators in the Victorian era often erased or swapped pronouns, terrified of what the original Greek might imply. There's even a theory that she ran a formal academy for young noblewomen, and that the affection in her poems was ceremonial, not sexual. But spend even a few minutes with her writing, and it becomes clear this isn't just pedagogy, it's poetry born from personal heat. You sit beside her as she revises a line, tapping her stylus against a worn tablet. Around her, the other women sing, debate philosophy, braid each other's hair. This isn't some hedonistic cult, despite what Roman writers would later suggest. It's a blend of intellect and sensuality, what we'd now call emotional polyamory. These women form connections that go beyond labels, rooted in admiration, creativity, and yes, romantic love. There's no one main relationship. Sappho's affections shift, evolve, loop back. Sometimes there's jealousy, sometimes generosity. She understands that desire isn't fixed, it's fluid, like the sea she writes about so often. Here's your delightfully weird detail. One of Sappho's surviving poems may have been preserved because someone used it as packing material for a mummy. That's how fragile her legacy is, stored on papyrus, reused as trash, and then rediscovered centuries later. And yet her influence survives. Even the philosopher Plato, no stranger to complex relationships, called her the 10th muse. Not bad for someone whose collected works now mostly exist in snippets. A few lines here, a single word there, enough to make your heart catch even through the erosion of time. But Sappho's life wasn't just poetry and soft kisses under olive trees. There's a darker thread. One legend says she threw herself off a cliff over unrequited love for a man. Another claims she was exiled for political reasons. Some versions of her story paint her as a tragic romantic, others as a radical intellectual whose ideas were too dangerous to preserve in full. Scholars now question whether any of these endings are real, or if they were invented by later writers uncomfortable with the idea of a woman living on her own terms, loving who she wanted, when she wanted. The scholarly debate continues. Was Sappho queer in a way that maps neatly onto modern categories? Or was she something else entirely? Many argue that trying to fit her into today's boxes misses the point, that her identity wasn't fixed, and that her poetry reflects a world where love didn't need to be justified or categorized. Others feel that reclaiming her as a queer icon is essential, a way of honouring voices that have been silenced by centuries of historical editing. You watch as she wraps her arms around one of her companions. No fanfare, no pretense, just quiet closeness. Another woman hands her a lyre. A melody starts. You don't know the words, but you feel them. They rise like the tide, slow and steady, aching with the kind of love that knows it won't last but still offers itself fully. Sappho isn't trying to possess her lovers, she's trying to capture them. If only for a few stanzas. As the sun sets over the Aegean, you realise something crucial. Sappho wasn't hiding. She wasn't a mystery to herself. The mystery is ours. The fragments we've found are enough to hint at a life richly filled with overlapping affections, with heartbreak and delight, with romantic constellations too intricate to chart. She didn't just experience love in multiples, she understood it, and then she turned it into verse. So maybe that's the legacy, not just the poetry, but the reminder that love doesn't always follow a straight path. Sometimes it weaves, loops, overlaps, and slips through your fingers. Sometimes it survives only in fragments, but that doesn't make it any less real. The rain falls in slow, silvery sheets as you step off a train platform in Paris, 1911. The platform's slick with puddles and anticipation, and the whole city smells like wet cobblestone, cigarette ash, and scandal. In the middle of it all stands a woman whose name is etched into the very foundations of science, Marie Curie. She adjusts her coat, ignores the reporters circling like flies, and walks forward with the purposeful stride of someone used to navigating storms, both meteorological and social. You think you know her, the Nobel Prize-winning pioneer, the grief-stricken widow, the focused scientist immune to distraction. But there's a chapter history nearly burned out of the books, a love affair that cracked the public's view of her, ignited international gossip, and exposed a hidden, passionate layer to one of the world's most brilliant minds. By this point in her life, Marie is already legend. She's the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. And then, just to make sure no one misses the point, she wins a second. Her love for her husband, Pierre Curie, was famously deep and intellectual. They collaborated not just in labs, but in life. Their marriage was a fusion of minds and mutual wonder, not the romantic fluff of novels, but something stronger, like molecules bonded under pressure. When Pierre died suddenly in a street accident in 1906, it shattered her. Publicly, she mourned with dignity. Privately, she fell into a depression so thick that for months she wandered Paris with his coat draped around her like a second skin. But Marie didn't dissolve into widowhood. She kept working harder than ever, and in that quiet intensity, a new relationship bloomed, one that would nearly destroy her reputation. Enter Paul Langevin, a physicist, a friend of Pierre's, handsome, younger, and, crucially, married. His marriage, however, was famously toxic. Estranged, volatile, with violent fights and no warmth left in it. Marie and Paul met often under the banner of scientific collaboration, but the chemistry wasn't just on the chalkboard. They began an affair, private, tender, and, by all accounts, deeply emotional. Not a fling, but a connection between two brilliant minds starved for affection and understanding. Of course, this is Paris, and nothing stays secret for long, especially not when the woman involved is the most famous female scientist in the world. A bundle of their private letters was stolen and leaked to the press. The French tabloids exploded. Headlines screamed of adultery and betrayal. Marie was painted as a homewrecker, a foreign seductress. She was Polish, which didn't help with the xenophobia. And, this, even accused of conducting emotional experiments on men. The public didn't know how to process a woman who could split atoms and still fall in love. Here's the quirky, almost comic detail. When the scandal hit, Marie was in Stockholm receiving her second Nobel Prize, in chemistry this time. The Swedish Academy begged her not to come, fearing backlash, but she showed up anyway, spine straight, jaw set, refusing to apologize. During her speech, she ignored the personal attacks entirely and focused on the science. You can practically hear her internal monologue, "Judge me for my work, not my lovers," and frankly, she deserved a third Nobel just for that level of poise. But while Marie tried to keep her composure, the world didn't let her forget. Students protested her lectures. Letters poured in calling her immoral. Men who had once supported her research turned their backs. Paul, cowardly and overwhelmed, retreated back into the crumbling remains of his marriage. He didn't publicly defend her, didn't stand beside her in the chaos. Marie, once again, was left alone, this time not as a widow, but as a woman publicly shamed for wanting love again. The academic debate here is sharper than a radium needle. Some scholars defend the relationship as a private matter blown wildly out of proportion by misogynistic press. Others argue that Marie, in seeking a relationship with a married man, opened herself to legitimate criticism. But underneath it all is a more pressing question. Why did society feel so betrayed by her? Was it because she fell in love, or because she dared to be more than the grieving widow and genius mother? Marie didn't write much about her feelings. She was famously private. But her few surviving letters to Paul reveal tenderness, frustration, and a need for emotional companionship that rivaled even her scientific obsession. She writes about missing his presence, about longing to see him again, about the heartbreak of being apart, not with melodrama, but with honesty. And in those lines, we glimpse the real woman, not just the icon, a woman capable of brilliant discoveries and emotional complexity. Who said she couldn't do both? You watch her now, in the lab at the Radium Institute, surrounded by chalkboards and beakers, sleeves rolled up, eyes locked on her work. After the scandal, she threw herself even deeper into research, isolating herself further. Her daughters, particularly Irene, would later follow in her footsteps. Not just scientifically, but personally, Irene herself living a marriage that was deeply collaborative and, according to some whispers, possibly open. The lingering question, was Marie polyamorous? The term didn't exist in her vocabulary, but her actions suggest a life that didn't limit love to traditional boundaries. She married once, loved deeply, grieved hard, and then fell for another man, while still honouring the first. She didn't replace Pierre with Paul, she layered love. She carried both at once, even when it hurt. As you step out of her lab into the chilly Paris dusk, you pass a statue, one of those polished, cold ones built to honour great minds without ever acknowledging their hearts. But Marie's real legacy isn't just in Nobel medals and periodic tables. It's in the fact that she dared to live, to love, to grieve, and then to love again, even when the world told her she wasn't allowed. That's a kind of bravery no textbook ever taught. You step into a room carved from cold stone and silence. A chisel clinks against marble, slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of a man who measures time in brushstrokes and hammer blows. Rome, early 16th century, the smell of wet plaster, olive oil, and something faintly metallic clings to the walls. In the half-light you see him, hunched over a slab of white Carrara marble, brow furrowed, jaw clenched. Michelangelo, the sculptor, the painter, the reluctant public figure. And, as we're about to uncover, the man with a love life as intricately layered as the folds in the robes of the Pietà. From the outside, he seems married to his art, and honestly, for most of his life, he preferred marble to people. He was famously solitary, irritable, kept strange hours, slept in his clothes, refused to bathe regularly, Biographers over the centuries have called him ascetic, devout, celibate. But dig a little deeper into his poetry, his letters, and the careful rumours whispered just outside the Vatican, and you find something far more textured. A man in love, again and again, but never in the way the church or the public wanted him to be. You catch him just as he sets down the chisel, wiping dust from his hands. He pulls out a scrap of parchment and begins to write a poem, one of hundreds. And the recipient, not a muse with flowing locks and delicate ankles, but Tommaso dei Cavalieri, a Roman nobleman and artist, 23 years old to Michelangelo's 57 when they met. Their friendship becomes a deep, emotionally intense connection. Michelangelo sends him poems, sketches, love notes that make scholars centuries later squirm with the intimacy of their phrasing. And here's the thing, he didn't hide them. Sure, he used metaphors and the kind of poetic ambiguity that artists have always leaned on to veil their feelings, but the emotion is unmistakable. In one poem he writes, "If I should want to kiss you, you would not deny me." It's not subtle, it's not platonic, and it's certainly not the expression of someone without desire. Tommaso, for his part, remained close to Michelangelo for decades. They exchanged gifts, stayed in touch long after the artist left Rome, and even after Michelangelo's death, Tommaso helped protect his legacy. Some historians insist their relationship was one of pure, chaste devotion. Others, reading between the sonnets, see the contours of romantic longing, possibly unconsummated, but no less consuming. But Tommaso wasn't the only male figure in Michelangelo's orbit. There was also Febo di Poggio, a young model whose beauty Michelangelo praised openly in both sketches and poetry, and Gerardo Perini, another man tied to his inner circle, whose fiery temperament mirrored Michelangelo's own. These relationships weren't passing flirtations, they were attachments, sometimes turbulent, sometimes adoring, always intense. And like many emotionally polyamorous people today, Michelangelo seemed to carry multiple bonds in parallel, devoting himself to different people in different ways, each with their own gravitational pull. Here's your fringe for poem fact. Michelangelo signed almost none of his sculptures, but he did leave his name on one, the Pietà. Why? According to one account, it was because someone claimed the work wasn't his, and his pride forced him to carve his name into Mary's sash in a moment of hot possessive ego. But others have argued that it was about legacy, not of art but of emotion. That sculpture, with its delicate sorrow, was possibly Michelangelo's most vulnerable work. He signed it not to claim authorship, but to make sure he was remembered as someone capable of feeling as well as creating. That gets to the heart of the academic debate. How do you define Michelangelo's relationships? Some scholars stick to the celibate genius theory, arguing he sublimated all romantic or sexual energy into his art. Others, more recent and frankly more daring, suggest that Michelangelo was queer in orientation and polyamorous in practice, forging layered, emotionally intense relationships that didn't conform to the rigid expectations of Renaissance morality. Still others believe he existed in the fluid space between, a man pulled by affection and admiration, but hemmed in by religion, reputation, and the heavy hands of institutional power. You walk with him through the Sistine Chapel, late at night, no one else around. He glances up at the ceiling, still fresh with colour, and mutters something under his breath about hating painting. He preferred sculpture, less mess, more clarity, but then you look at the creation of Adam, the almost touch between God and man, fingers hovering millimetres apart, and you realise, this is a man obsessed with intimacy, with nearness, with the unbearable almost. Is there in his work, in his poetry, in every strained relationship he nurtured, but never fully claimed. As he aged, his relationships shifted from romantic to spiritual. He grew more religious, more withdrawn, and more anxious about his soul. He worried, not just about dying, but about how he'd be remembered. Would his work survive? Would his name? Would the people he loved, truly loved, understand that he had done the best he could in a world that didn't let him be open? After his death in 1564, many of his more personal poems were edited. Pronouns changed, names scrubbed, love recoded as friendship. It was a literary sanitization, one designed to preserve his genius while erasing the complications. It worked too. For centuries, Michelangelo was remembered as a lonely genius, a religious mystic. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to piece together the fuller picture, the quieter truth, the fragments of love left unsanded. So was Michelangelo polyamorous, not in the structured modern way, but emotionally, profoundly. He formed deep, layered, simultaneous attachments that shaped his art, his mood, his theology. He loved with intensity and from a distance. Not because he lacked courage, but because the cost of closeness was higher than even a genius could afford. As you step away from the chapel, your eyes adjust to the dim hallway beyond. Michelangelo's shadow stretches along the wall behind you. Not cold, not lonely, but heavy with all the love he carved into stone when the world wouldn't let him speak it aloud. The sun hangs low over the rooftops of Paris, casting the whole left bank in honey-coloured nostalgia. You're standing on a quiet street in the 6th arrondissement, in front of a house with a green door and a brass plaque that reads 27 Rue des Fleurus. Inside, history is cooking literally. You step into the warm, aromatic world of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, and immediately you're surrounded by the smell of simmering lamb, fresh herbs, and typewriter ink. This isn't just a home, it's a salon, a laboratory for art and ideas, a domestic stay for one of the most fascinating and enduring partnerships in literary history. But tonight, we're not here just for the guest list. We're here for the unconventional structure of a relationship that may not be famous for its romantic turbulence, but quietly rewrote the rules of queer partnership and polyamorous intimacy. Gertrude sits in a large armchair, short stoutette wrapped in a heavy vest. Alice flits around her like a ballet dancer with a purpose, checking the roast, adjusting the lighting, placing Gertrude's favourite cigarette just so on the table. It's a ritual, performed nightly. Gertrude writes, Alice edits, types, organises, feeds her, and fiercely manages her calendar. Their love isn't loud or fragile. It's built like an old cathedral, solid, intricate, deeply lived in. By all appearances, they're a monogamous couple, inseparable for nearly 4 decades, sleeping in the same room, eating the same meals, buried side by side. But scratch the surface and the walls don't quite meet at right angles. Their social life is a constant carousel of brilliant, flirtatious, emotionally entangled visitors. Picasso, Hemingway, Matisse, Braque, Ezra Pound. Artists, writers, dancers, lesbians, dilettantes. The Rue de Fleurus was a place where art happened and hearts got complicated. People didn't just come for dinner, they came to orbit, to be seen, to be adored, and often to be folded into the peculiar gravitational pull of Gertrude and Alice's universe. You watch as a young female painter named Félicité arrives for dinner. She's dazzling, bright red lips, a laugh like falling water. Gertrude's eyes linger on her a little too long. Alice notices, she always notices, but nothing is said. Later, when everyone's gone, Gertrude will write a poem about a woman with hands too generous, and Alice will press her lips together and keep typing. It's a dynamic they both understand. Devotion doesn't always mean exclusivity. Here's your quirky footnote. In the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is famously written by Gertrude in Alice's voice, there are entire chapters dedicated to Gertrude's literary brilliance, art collection, and friendships, and very little about Alice's own feelings. It's oddly third person for a supposed autobiography. The joke, of course, is that Gertrude was writing about herself all along, using Alice's name as a kind of emotional procle. But between the lines, you can sense the negotiation happening. Love expressed through control, affection through authorship, loyalty through seance. And yet they built something remarkably functional. While many other historical figures on this journey burned down their relationships with passion and drama, Gertrude and Alice curated theirs with discipline. But that doesn't mean it was emotionally monogamous. Letters reveal Gertrude's close, even infatuated relationships with other women, some clearly flirtatious, others tinged with longing. Alice, in turn, maintained her own private attachments, though always more discreet. Their arrangement, never spelled out but deeply understood, wasn't one of open beds, but open emotions, a kind of intellectual and emotional polyamory that allowed for outside fascination without fracturing the core bond. Scholars still wrestle with how to categorize this relationship. Some insist they were a model of early lesbian domesticity, tightly sealed and interdependent. Others argue for a broader lens, that their lives and letters suggest a version of love built around multiplicity, not possession. Gertrude's writing often deconstructs traditional romance, pulling apart the syntax of affection, rebuilding it with rhythm, not rules. In one of her most famous poems, she writes, "A rose is a rose is a rose." But later, to Alice, she writes, "A rose is not a rose when you are not." She understood that love could be both fixed and fluid, simple and endlessly revised. One under-discussed element of their relationship is the role power played. Gertrude was the voice, Alice was the hand. Gertrude gave the speeches, Alice managed the aftermath. Their bond was thick with love but also hierarchy. Alice once described her role as secretary and companion, but she also called Gertrude my husband, and in letters to friends she spoke about our marriage. It's hard not to see the depth of their commitment, but also the ways it may have left Alice folded quietly inside someone else's legend. Was that sacrifice, or was it a chosen form of devotion? A love that didn't need to be symmetrical to feel complete. Here's the fringe detail you didn't expect. Alice B. Toklas is responsible for introducing cannabis brownies to the American counterculture. In the 1950s, she published the Alice B. Toklas cookbook, and tucked in among the bœuf bourguignon and almond sponge cakes was a recipe for hashish fudge, a slyly titled dessert involving ground cannabis, spices, and a bunch of laughter. She claimed it was a friend's recipe, but the legacy stuck. This quiet, unassuming woman, who once devoted herself entirely to another's genius, became a surprise icon of 1960s psychedelia, which honestly is poetic. As Gertrude aged and eventually died in 1946, Alice's world crumbled. Without legal recognition, she had no claim to the house or art collection. She lived the rest of her life in relative obscurity and dwindling means, supported quietly by friends and loyal readers, and yet she remained loyal to Gertrude's memory until her own death. Some call it tragic, others see it as proof that theirs was a love deeper than paperwork could ever measure. So were Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas polyamorous? Not in the way that invites group chats and kitchen calendars, but emotionally, absolutely. They lived in a house filled with flirtation, fascination, and layered connections. Their love wasn't defined by monogamy or rebellion. It was something more curated. A still life of intimacy, carefully composed but bursting with more colour than anyone realised until much later. As you step back into the twilight of Paris, the smell of roast still lingering, you glance up at the green door one last time. It closes gently behind you. Inside, the typewriter waits. A cigarette smoulders in an ashtray. And somewhere, always, a poem is writing itself about a woman who loved fiercely and let herself love in more than one direction at once. You're standing in the glowing heart of late Victorian London, the street lamps flickering like the eyes of gossiping onlookers, fog curling at your ankles like it's trying to eavesdrop. Somewhere in the distance, a piano plays a too-slow waltz, and outside a posh theatre, the night's marquee spells out the importance of being earnest. You've arrived just before the curtain rises, both on the play and on the slow, painful unravelling of its creator's private life. Because behind Oscar Wilde's sharp wit and velvet coats lies one of the most iconic, tragic, and defiant love stories in queer history. A double life, a love triangle turned scandal, and a legacy that clings to the word dangerous even now. Wilde steps onto the scene exactly as you imagine, towering, flamboyant, a walking quote machine, cravat just slightly askew for aesthetic purposes. He is the darling of London's elite, a playwright whose dialogue crackles with sarcasm and elegance, and whose salon appearances draw aristocrats like moths to his incandescent presence. Publicly, he's married to Constance Lloyd, a thoughtful woman with radical leanings and tragic patience. They have 2 children, a lovely house, a normal enough life on the surface. But Wilde doesn't belong on the surface. His heart lives in the shadows. You find him in a candlelit drawing room, eyes locked with someone across the table, Lord Alfred Douglas, known to his friends and enemies as Bosie. Young, beautiful, reckless, the poet type who hasn't yet learned how much destruction a line of verse can carry. Wilde is nearly 40, Bosie is 21. Their relationship begins like a fever dream. Endless letters, secret meetings, mutual obsession. Wilde is swept off his feet not just by Bosie's beauty, but by his boldness. Bosie doesn't hide, he flirts in public, he signs letters with pet names. He pulls Wilde further out of the closet than Wilde may have been ready to go, but Wilde doesn't stop him. Because this isn't just infatuation, this is someone finally being seen. The thing is, Wilde isn't monogamous, not emotionally and certainly not physically. Before Bosie, there were other lovers. After Bosie, even more. He moves through the underworld of London's queer nightlife with curiosity and confidence, forming brief but intense connections with younger men, Students, working-class youths. It's a pattern, intellectual stimulation paired with physical hunger, layered over an emotional ache Wilde can never quite articulate. His relationships with men are often overlapping, sometimes transactional, always risky, and still he writes about love like it's salvation. Here's your fringe fact. Wilde coined the phrase, the love that dare not speak its name, or at least popularised it when he was put on trial for gross indecency. It was Boesie's poem that originally used the line, but Wilde, when asked to explain it under oath, delivered a full-throated defence of male-male affection that left the courtroom in stunned silence. He described it as such great affection of an elder for a younger man, such as Plato made the basis of his philosophy. In that moment, Wilde became more than a defendant. He became a martyr in real time, and this is where everything crashes. Boesie's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, finds out about the relationship and is not amused. He leaves a note at Wilde's club, accusing him of posing as a somdomite, sick. Wilde, pushed by Boesie's pride and his own wounded sense of honour, sues him for libel. A terrible decision. During the trial, Wilde's personal letters are read aloud. His previous lovers are tracked down. The courtroom becomes a theatre of humiliation. Wilde is arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. Constance takes the children and moves abroad. Boesie flees, and the darling of the London stage becomes prisoner C33. You see Wilde now, gaunt and hollow-eyed, scrubbing prison floors and writing what may be his greatest work. De Profundis, a long, blistering letter to Boesie filled with pain, love, blame, and reluctant forgiveness. In it, Wilde wrestles with the chaos of their relationship, the toxicity, the beauty, the way Boesie both inspired and destroyed him. It's not a breakup letter, it's a post-mortem, of a love that burned too fast and too wildly for its own good. Scholars still debate whether Wilde and Boesie's relationship qualifies as polyamorous. Technically, it was a mix of serial monogamy, overlapping trysts, and emotional enmeshment with a network of lovers. But if polyamory is about loving multiple people deeply and without deception, at least among the parties involved, so Wilde's life was more irregular. He was honest with himself, less so with society, sometimes cruel in his silences, sometimes radiant in his affections. He wasn't a role model, but he was real, and in his own way defiant. After his release from prison, Wilde wanders through Europe under a false name, cut off from his children, broken financially, and constantly surveilled. He and Boesie attempt to reunite briefly, but the damage is too deep. Wilde dies in Paris in 1900 at the age of 46. His last words, reportedly muttered while staring at the hideous wallpaper in his room, were, "Either that wallpaper goes or I do." Even at the edge of death, the wit remained. The heart, however, had already been torn apart. His grave now stands in Père Lachaise Cemetery, a sleek modernist monument covered in lipstick kisses from admirers. But it's not just fans of the picture of Dorian Gray who make the pilgrimage. It's people who understand what it means to be punished for who they love, to have their passion held up as evidence, to be brilliant and bruised at the same time. So was Oscar Wilde a polyamorous genius? Not in the polished community workshop sense, but he lived in a state of emotional overflow, of layered connections and unapologetic desire. He loved deeply and destructively, simultaneously selfish and self-sacrificing, and in doing so he cracked open a cultural door that can never be closed again. As the fog closes in around you, you hear a faint echo of laughter from the corner of the street. It's Wilde's voice, mischievous, mocking and wounded all at once. Love, he reminds you, is not always kind, but it is always worth writing about. You're in St. Petersburg now, though you'd be forgiven for mistaking it for a stage set. The corridors glitter with gold leaf and polished marble. The air is thick with rosewater and imperial intrigue, and everyone speaks in half-truths and full-on flattery. Tonight, the Winter Palace isn't just a seat of power, it's a bedroom maze, a carefully managed parade of silk sheets, whispered promises, and lovers chosen with more calculation than Cupid ever intended. At the centre of it all sits Catherine the Great, draped in furs and fanning herself with a document she probably rewrote that morning just to make it better. She's the Empress of Russia, the Enlightenment on heels, and if history has tried to reduce her to tabloid gossip, well, tonight we're rewriting the record. Because Catherine's love life wasn't just spicy, it was brilliantly, unapologetically polyamorous in structure and statecraft. Let's get the elephant out of the room first. No, she did not die in a particularly unspeakable way involving a horse. That's pure slander. invented long after her death, probably by men made uncomfortable by a woman who held an empire and a lover in each hand. So now that that's settled, let's focus on the real stories. The ones that don't just confirm her romantic appetite, but reveal a woman who turned desire into diplomacy. You see her first at age 33, newly widowed, not by chance, mind you, but by a quiet coup that took her incompetent husband Peter III off the throne and, very possibly, off the mortal plane. Power sits on her shoulders like a perfectly tailored cloak, and she wastes no time surrounding herself with trusted advisors. Some of them are generals, while some are scholars. Many, let's be real, are stunningly attractive men who happen to have a taste for adventure and zero ambitions of replacing her. That's a key qualification. Her lovers are known as favourites, a term that sounds delicate but means exactly what you think. They were publicly acknowledged, housed comfortably, and rotated out with more dignity than most modern breakups can manage. Some stayed for months, others for years. A few, like Grigory Orlov, father to one of her children, and Grigory Potemkin, arguably the love of her life, held influence that outlasted their romantic tenure. Catherine didn't believe in tossing people aside, she believed in keeping them useful, and here's where things get structured. Potemkin, for example, was more than just a lover. He was a co-ruler in all but name. Their relationship, intense and tempestuous, shifted over time from sexual to strategic. After their romance cooled, they reportedly created a kind of open arrangement. He helped her select future favourites. Yes, you heard that right, and continued to wield a massive influence behind the scenes. You watch them walking the palace gardens, bickering like old spouses, laughing like old friends, whispering about the empire like co-conspirators. There's no bitterness, just a profound understanding that love isn't always linear. Here's your quirky historical gem. Catherine actually interviewed potential lovers. These weren't just flings. Candidates were vetted. Their intelligence, charm and loyalty were considered. Think of it as a kind of emotional vetting committee, with velvet gloves and courtly etiquette. Once selected, a favourite received rooms in the palace, titles, gifts, sometimes even land. And when their time ended, they were pensioned off handsomely, often remaining friends or at least loyal subjects. There was no ghosting, no scandalous exit, just a well-oiled system of state-approved affection. Of course, this didn't sit well with everyone. Foreign dignitaries whispered behind their fans. Domestic rivals sneered. The French especially had opinions, they always do, about a woman daring to enjoy power and pleasure. But Catherine didn't flinch. She wrote openly in her diaries about the nature of desire, about the need for companionship, about the difference between political union and emotional fulfillment. In private correspondence, she once quipped, "I need a man as much as a man needs a pair of boots in winter." That's Catherine, warm, pragmatic, and capable of ruling with an iron fist and a feathered fan at the same time. But not all of her affairs were harmonious. Some favourites overreached. Some became jealous or delusional, believing they could rule beside her or control her heart. They were quickly reminded that Catherine did not share power. She distributed affection generously, but rule, that was hers alone. She used her romantic entanglements to manage court factions, reward loyalty, even stabilise foreign policy. It wasn't just indulgence, it was strategy dressed as scandal. Now, scholars argue endlessly over whether Catherine's polyamorous tendencies were personal or political. Was she genuinely drawn to multiple partners in the modern sense of loving freely and honestly? Or did she simply find that keeping several emotional bonds open was the best way to avoid vulnerability? The truth may be a little of both. Catherine was deeply intellectual, corresponding with Enlightenment figures like Voltaire and Diderot, and believed in the power of reason, even in love. But she was also emotional, romantic, prone to infatuation, and capable of profound devotion. Polyamory, for her, wasn't just about pleasure. It was about survival, power, and companionship in a world where no man could ever be her equal. As you walk through the palace now, you see portraits of her bastards lining the halls, not hidden away in shame, but displayed like bookmarks in the story of her reign. Each one marked a chapter, some passionate, some political, some a little of both. And yet, she remains at the centre of it all, untouched by the chaos that often surrounds tangled love lives, because Catherine didn't let love consume her. She harnessed it. She died in 1796 at the age of 67, still powerful, still writing letters, still speaking of love like a scholar and a queen in equal measure. Her legacy is tangled in myth, yes, but the truth beneath the gossip is far more fascinating. She didn't reject love or limit it. She redefined it, on her own terms, with her own rules, and perhaps most importantly, without shame. So was Catherine the Great polyamorous? Absolutely, though she wouldn't have used the term. She was a monarch of many hearts, a ruler of affections with a system to match. Her love life was not chaos. It was courtly, and above all it was hers. You're trailing behind James Baldwin on a quiet Paris street, the kind of street that seems to stretch beyond time, cobblestones glistening from a recent rain, the scent of Gauloise's smoke and espresso thick in the air. He walks slowly, his overcoat wrapped tight, a book under one arm and a lifetime of ache pressed just behind his eyes. He's not speaking, but the silence around him hums with language, raw, relentless, necessary. Baldwin's life, like his writing, was full of crossings, of oceans, of race lines, of love lines, of the rules that told him who he could be and who he couldn't touch. Tonight you're stepping into those crossings, not to fix a label on them, but to walk beside them just long enough to understand the polyamorous pull that shaped one of the sharpest minds of the 20th century. Most know Baldwin as a writer, an activist, a prophet in prose. The voice behind Go Tell It on the Mountain, The Fire Next Time and Giovanni's Room, but beyond the fire and rhetoric, there's the James Baldwin who loved, fiercely, widely and across the margins. A man who refused to narrow his heart to one person, one place, or even one kind of relationship. He didn't live in neat chapters. He lived in overlapping paragraphs, contradictions, and half-finished love stories that all fed back into the bloodstream of his work. You sit with him in a small Parisian cafe in the 1950s, jazz crackling through the walls, the warmth of candlelight catching the reflection of a man across from him. His name is Lucien, a Swiss man who will become one of Baldwin's early complicated partners. Their relationship is intense, part romance, part argument, part mirror. Baldwin writes about him as both muse and heartache, someone who represents not just desire, but the tangled way love and power play out across race and class. Lucien is white, European, and often careless with Baldwin's heart. And still Baldwin stays, because love for him is never clean, it's never safe. But Lucien is only one name in a long list of lovers and companions who moved through Baldwin's orbit. There was Bernard Hassel, a black American man he met in New York. Later, there were men in Istanbul, lovers in Paris, one-night connections in Berlin or Harlem that still found their way into his letters, essays, or dialogue. Baldwin didn't hide these relationships, though he didn't always shout them from rooftops either. He folded them into his fiction, letting desire stretch beyond the confines of gender or singularity. In Giovanni's Room, he writes of longing and guilt, tenderness and fear, the ache of wanting more than one version of love to be possible. It's fiction, but barely. It's James in translation. Here's your off-the-beaten-path detail. Baldwin once had a brief, intense relationship with Turkish actor Engin Seza, who played Hamlet in a production Baldwin helped script. The passion was short-lived but deeply formative. While living in Istanbul, Baldwin felt more free than anywhere else, racially anonymous, sexually less policed. He called it his home away from home. He described the experience of love there as less political, though no less layered. It was a place where he could briefly allow love to exist without translating it for anyone else's approval. So it was Baldwin polyamorous in the modern sense? Sort of. He didn't use the language. He never gave an interview about ethical non-monogamy or relationship hierarchies, but what he practiced over decades was emotional polyphony, a heart tuned to multiple frequencies at once. Baldwin had lovers he stayed connected to long after the romance cooled, friends he kissed, partners he never moved in with, and strangers who sparked something so fleeting and potent that he wrote about them for years. His heart didn't operate on exclusivity, it operated on depth, and sometimes that depth happened in duplicate. Scholars debate how open Baldwin truly was about his romantic life. Some say he deliberately kept things veiled, using fiction to speak truths he couldn't say outright in the interviews or speeches. Others argue that he was radically transparent for his time, a black gay man writing about same-sex love in the 1950s, when it could have cost him everything. Still others say Baldwin's resistance to monogamy was more about freedom than philosophy, that he wasn't campaigning for a movement, he was just refusing to be caged. You see him now in a New York apartment in the 70s, older, heavier, voice still soft but edged with the weight of years. A younger man sits beside him, laughing at something in one of Baldwin's books, probably one of the lines that make you pause and wince because it's so true, it hurts. They aren't a couple, at least not officially, but they share something, a bed, a language, a secret rhythm. Baldwin never lived with just one lover for long. He was constantly moving, constantly reshaping home around people rather than places, and yet he wasn't afraid of commitment, just its limitations. He remained emotionally connected to past lovers for decades, exchanging letters, visiting, offering support. If polyamory is about sustaining multiple threads of connection with honesty and care, Baldwin was practicing it before most people had the word. He knew that loving more than one person wasn't failure, it was risk. And risk was what made life real. As he once wrote, "Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within." Baldwin's love life wasn't perfect. It was often lonely, sometimes messy, occasionally self-destructive. But it was always true. He loved as he wrote, with vulnerability, with power, with fire that refused to dim just because someone else couldn't handle the heat. Now, as you walk with him one last time through a quiet Paris alley, you feel the echoes of every place he called home. Harlem, Istanbul, Saint-Paul-de-Vence. His lovers are gone now, scattered across pages and memory. But the structure remains, a life built not around possession, but around presence. Around the idea that love, like art, must be free to change shape. So yes, James Baldwin loved many, simultaneously, as fully as he could. And when history tried to edit that out, he turned it into literature, so no one could pretend otherwise. You wake up tangled in linen and sunlight, and the heat hits you immediately. Egypt, ancient, eternal, and entirely alert. You're in Alexandria, but not the library, the bedroom. This time, it's not about scrolls or scholars, it's about Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, and a woman whose love life didn't just stir scandal, it rewrote the geopolitical map of the Mediterranean. Forget the snake stories and that famous eyeliner flick. What we're focusing on tonight is her emotional strategy, her layered, powerful, and unapologetically polyamorous relationships with men who weren't just lovers, they were empires. She's lounging on a dais now, golden bracelets stacked up to her elbows, eyes sharp even in repose. Cleopatra was never passive in love. She didn't wait to be chosen. She did the choosing, and she chose well. First up, Julius Caesar. Their relationship starts not as a seduction, but as a calculated survival move. Cleopatra's embroiled in a brutal sibling rivalry. Yes, Egypt loved a good family feud. And Caesar arrives right when she needs a powerful Roman ally. So what does she do? She wraps herself in a rug, literally, and has it smuggled into his chambers. You've got to respect that level of entrance-making. From there, the two become entangled politically, emotionally, physically. They have a child, Caesarean. She visits Rome. He praises her intelligence and charm in private, but parades her presence with a certain strategic flair. It's not love in the modern Disney sense. It's respect mixed with fascination, with ambition wrapped around desire. And when Caesar is assassinated, Cleopatra doesn't waste time mourning too publicly. She returns to Egypt, and soon enough there's a new Roman heart to tangle with. Enter Mark Antony. If Caesar was calculated power, Antony is burning instinct. Their connection is immediate and wild. They throw lavish feasts, dress as Greek gods, write poetry, play drinking games, stage elaborate mock weddings for amusement. They're two people who've seen the world burn and decided to toast to it instead. And yet, underneath all that decadence is something surprisingly tender. They marry, have children, and co-rule. Their alliance is both romantic and profoundly political. Antony needs Egypt's wealth and navy. Cleopatra needs his military support and Roman legitimacy. It's symbiosis with a champagne buzz. But here's the twist. Cleopatra never disavows Caesar's memory. Even as she builds a new life with Antony, she maintains Caesarean's claim as Caesar's heir. She weaves both relationships into her identity, into her rulership, into her own mythology. She doesn't choose one man to define her legacy, she chooses both. Her love life becomes a double strand, two Roman giants, two sons of empire held simultaneously in her orbit. And here's your fringe fact. Cleopatra maintained diplomatic relationships with other rulers that likely had emotional and possibly romantic components. There's speculation about her interactions with Herod the Great, with various Eastern kings, and with scholars and advisors in her court. She understood how to create emotional connections that served larger purposes. She knew that attraction was a form of diplomacy, and that affection, when wielded wisely, was a weapon even sharper than a sword. Was she a polyamorist in the way we use the term today? Maybe not by name, but absolutely in spirit. Cleopatra's love life wasn't just layered, it was braided. She didn't move from lover to lover like chapters in a book. She carried connections forward, overlapping, combining, integrating them into a single vast narrative. Each relationship had its own timeline, its own emotional weight, but none cancelled out the others. She built a life where multiple truths could exist at once. She loved Caesar and Antony. She was a mother, a partner, a queen, a strategist. No single relationship defined her. Together, they made her legend. Of course, history hasn't always been kind about this. Roman historians, male predictably, called her a temptress, a manipulator, a sorceress. They couldn't fathom a woman who wielded both intellect and sexuality without apology. Shakespeare turned her into a tragic figure. Later writers painted her as a cautionary tale. But modern scholars are starting to push back, reframing her story not as scandalous but strategic, not licentious but layered. She didn't fall into powerful men's beds, she invited them into her throne room. You now watch the end unfold in slow motion. The Battle of Actium, a naval disaster. Antony's defeat. Their suicides, his by sword, hers allegedly by asp. But even in death, Cleopatra controls the narrative. She ensures her children's futures, hides treasures, leaves behind symbols, and though the Romans try to erase her, they fail. Her name survives. Her image, too. Coins, temples, myths. She's become a figure of power and desire so potent that 2,000 years later, we are still arguing over whether she was more lover or leader. Here's the debate. Was Cleopatra's polyamorous life a form of agency, or was it shaped entirely by necessity? Did she truly love these men, or did she love what they offered her kingdom? Some argue she used romance as a tool. Others argue she simply had the capacity to love more than one person at a time, and the intelligence not to apologize for it. The truth, like the woman herself, is probably a mixture of intention and instinct. You walk out of her chambers, past walls painted with lotus flowers and stars. The air is still warm, still filled with the echoes of laughter and whispered plans. She's gone, yes, but the imprint remains. A queen who held multiple hearts without ever losing her own. Who kissed gods and shook hands with generals, and knew that power and passion were not opposites but mirrors. So was Cleopatra polyamorous? In all the ways that matter. She lived multiple truths at once, loved more than one man without betraying any of them, and built an empire out of emotional intelligence as much as political force. And when history tried to write her off, she became something even stronger. A woman too complicated to fit in a single story. The fireplace crackles softly in a narrow English sitting room, casting flickering light onto the stack of books teetering dangerously on the arm of an overstuffed chair. There's the quiet hum of a kettle warming in the kitchen, a shuffle of slippers on wood. It's a peaceful evening, too peaceful perhaps, for a woman whose mind is anything but still. You're here with Virginia Woolf again, but this time the light is different. Softer, sadder. Less about the fire of forbidden passion, and more about the strange, steady warmth of something even rarer, a love that doesn't need sex to survive. Tonight, we slip quietly into the other half of Virginia's polyamorous life, the one so often overshadowed by Vita Sackville West and the salons of Bloomsbury, the one shaped not by desire, but by devotion, the one named Leonard. Leonard Woolf sits at his desk now, fingers tapping methodically on a typewriter, a pot of ink close by, just in case. He's the opposite of flamboyant, practical to a fault, politically sharp, emotionally restrained, and yet he married Virginia, a woman known for drowning in feelings, for disappearing into thoughts, for needing both freedom and anchoring in equal measure. Their marriage was, by all surface accounts, odd. They never had children, never shared a passionate sex life. Virginia wrote openly about her lack of sexual desire for him in letters and diaries, and yet the bond between them wasn't thin. It was thick with time and trust and an intimate kind of knowing. You imagine the quiet conversations they must have had after dinner, her feet tucked beneath her on the couch, his hand cradling a mug, the two of them not looking at each other, but sharing the same silence. That kind of intimacy is hard to define, harder still to fake. Leonard edited her work, nursed her through breakdowns, protected her from public scrutiny and private implosion, and she, in return, gave him her loyalty, her writing, her life, however fragile it sometimes felt. What makes this relationship truly polyamorous in spirit is how Leonard and Virginia allowed and even supported each other's emotional openness to others. Leonard was aware of her infatuations with women, especially Vita. He didn't forbid them, didn't demand fidelity in the traditional sense. Instead, he gave her room, not passively, deliberately, as if he understood that the heart is not a container, but a river. It's meant to move, to branch, to swell. And while Vita may have sparked her fire, Leonard kept the hearth warm. Here's your unexpected, almost sweet historical tidbit. Leonard used to make Virginia toast, a lot of toast. When she was spiraling into depression or feeling unmoored from reality, he didn't try to fix her with grand declarations. He just made her tea, sat beside her, brought her toast quietly. This is love, too. The kind that understands how to hold a trembling world in a single, steady act. And yet their arrangement wasn't without tension. Virginia sometimes felt stifled by Leonard's quiet control. His hyper-attentiveness could feel more like a keeper than a companion. She resented the way he managed her illness, even as she depended on it. In her journals, she writes about wanting more space, more life, more, and yet she always returns to his voice, his grounding, his understanding that her love wasn't exclusive, but it was sincere. Scholars have long debated the shape of their marriage. Some call it a friendship draped in domestic routines. Others insist it was a deep romantic bond expressed in a language we rarely recognize because it wasn't sexual. But perhaps the truth is more generous, that Leonard and Virginia's relationship was a version of polyamory that didn't need labels or negotiations. It simply was. He didn't need to be the only person she loved. He just needed to be the person who stayed. You see this most clearly in the years after Vita, when Virginia's infatuations cooled and her mental health began to wobble once again. Leonard remained, through the silence, through the episodes, through the waves of brilliance and the crushing lows. He stood beside her as she built the Hogarth Press, as she wrote Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, the Waves. He cheered her, challenged her, cared for her. He didn't try to replace Vita or compete with her memory. He simply carried on building something else, a quiet, essential kind of intimacy. Here's the fringe debate. Some modern theorists suggest that Leonard himself may have been asexual, or at least disinterested in traditional expressions of passion. His diaries and letters rarely speak of sexual desire, and he seems more driven by companionship and intellectual partnership. Was this an arrangement of convenience? Or was it a rare meeting of two people whose needs didn't align in a conventional way but still clicked together like strange, perfect puzzle pieces? When Virginia died in 1941, filling her pockets with stones and walking into the River Ouse, it was Leonard who found her final note. In it she wrote, "I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been." It's devastating, not just because it ends a life, but because it encapsulates a love the world often refuses to believe is enough. But Leonard knew it was real. And for the rest of his life he protected her legacy, her work, her words. He never remarried. He never disavowed her or diminished their bond. Instead, he made sure her voice endured. You're sitting now in their old garden at the monk's house, the sun dappling through the trees, the ghosts of two people still lingering somewhere between the hedgerows. It wasn't a passionate love story. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't even easy to explain. But it was love, deep, unshakable, non-monogamous in practice, utterly devoted in heart. So, was Virginia Woolf polyamorous? Emotionally, without question. And Leonard, though not flamboyant, not fiery, may have been her greatest partner because he understood that loving someone doesn't always mean being their everything. Sometimes it means being their anchor, even if you're not their spark. You hear it before you see it. The thrum of piano keys, slow and searching, echoing through a candlelit apartment in early 19th century Vienna. The room smells of parchment and pipe smoke, and the windows rattle faintly from the wind sweeping across the Danube. This is where Ludwig van Beethoven lives now, in solitude, wrapped in layers of wool and increasingly thick scents. His hearing is all but gone, but his inner world roars louder than ever. You're here to unravel a mystery, one that has obsessed scholars and romantics alike for 2 centuries. A love story written in ink, not music, addressed to no one, signed to no one. A letter written to my immortal beloved. Beethoven's romantic life is a mess of blurred names, private agonies, and sudden disappearances. He never married. He proposed several times, always to women far above his social station, and was always turned down or rejected indirectly. His temper didn't help, nor did his increasingly erratic health or volatile moods, but still he loved, deeply, possibly too deeply if you read the way he spilled himself across pages, pleading, apologizing, hoping. And the immortal beloved letter, found among his papers after his death in 1827, is the clearest glimpse we have into a heart that most people assumed was buried beneath ego and genius. You lean in now, reading the letter as Beethoven once scribbled it. My angel, my all, my very self, can our love endure except through sacrifices? It is raw and poetic and scattered across several pages, full of longing and conflict. He writes of an intense passion and a shared commitment, but also of physical separation and unspeakable obstacles. He writes like a man torn between obsession and duty, overwhelmed by a love he cannot fully have, but refuses to let go of. He signs it simply, ever thine, ever mine, ever ours, but to whom? The contenders for the title of immortal beloved form a tangled constellation of noblewomen, students, widows, and maybe even a few men, depending on which scholar you ask. Antonia Brentano is a strong favourite, married, well-connected, and present in Beethoven's life at key emotional peaks. They shared intense correspondence, overlapping travel, private meetings. But her married status and Beethoven's own tortured morality complicated things. He would have never openly pursued a long-term relationship with a married woman, at least not in the light. Then there's Josephine Brunswick, a Hungarian countess and piano student who possibly came the closest to being his true partner. Their letters suggest deep emotional attachment and an enduring affection that survived years of distance. Some biographers argue she's the one, the timings match, the tone fits, and Beethoven once wrote of loving her until death. But again, class differences, family pressure, and Josephine's own ambivalence made permanence impossible. And then there's a third camp made up of more fringe voices that proposes the letter may not have been written to a woman at all. Some suggest it was never meant to be found, and that its language, so romantic, so confessional, could have been addressed to a man. Beethoven's friendships with men were often intense and uncomfortably intimate by 19th century standards. One name occasionally floated is Franz Gerhard Wegeler, a lifelong friend and early confidant. The theory remains controversial but quietly persistent. Because here's the thing, the ambiguity isn't just about gender, it's about identity. The beloved remains nameless, shapeless, eternal. That ambiguity is what leads some scholars to speculate that Beethoven's love life may have been, if not explicitly polyamorous, then certainly polyaffectionate. He poured himself into multiple people simultaneously, sustaining deep emotional attachments even when one affair faded. He was never quite done, never fully disconnected. In one letter he chastises a former lover for marrying someone else, then in the next breath praises her kindness and wishes her peace. It's not possessive, it's layered. As if his heart didn't work in isolation, it functioned like a symphony, multiple voices all rising and falling at once. And here's your off-the-path detail. Beethoven never wrote an opera about romantic love that ends in tragedy. Fidelio, his only opera, is about conjugal devotion, yes, but also freedom, resilience, and endurance through misunderstanding. It's not grand tragedy, it's stubborn hope. And in that light, the immortal beloved becomes not just a person, but a concept, belief in the enduring power of connection, even if it's fractured or incomplete. You see him now, hunched at the piano, the keys rattling beneath the hands that don't always cooperate anymore. He plays not to impress, but to sec, because language is slipping away, but music still answers him. His love letters live not just in words, but in sonatas. The Moonlight Sonata, possibly inspired by Giulietta Guicciardi, another noblewoman he adored briefly before losing her to status and distance. The Appassionata, burned through with frustration and longing. Even the Eroica Symphony, originally dedicated to Napoleon, feels less like political homage and more like a requiem for betrayed ideals, personal ones included. Was Beethoven capable of a monogamous life? Maybe not. His mood swings, health issues, and societal status made deep, sustained intimacy difficult, but that doesn't mean he lacked capacity for love. On the contrary, his letters show someone who wanted everything, not in a greedy way, but in an earnest, desperate, sometimes self-destructive way. He wanted deep friendship, romantic loyalty, artistic communion, all at once, and when he couldn't have it, he built it out of sound. In his final years, Beethoven grew more isolated. His deafness became total, his health declined, but he still composed, still dreamed, still remembered. Somewhere in his desk he kept that letter, folded, unsigned, unsent, or perhaps always a sent, just never received. As you leave the room, the last notes of a piano sonata echo behind you. You don't know who the immortal beloved was, no one does. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the greatest composer of all time couldn't be contained by one muse, one name, one type of love. Maybe his heart was, quite literally, a composition of many voices, none louder than the rest, all eternally his. The smell hits you first, linseed oil, tobacco, and something sharper, something like wet clay and turpentine-stained sweat. You're inside Pablo Picasso's studio in Montmartre, and it's exactly the kind of controlled chaos you'd expect from the man who shattered art into 1,000 angles. Canvases lean against the walls like forgotten lovers. The floor is littered with discarded sketches, crumpled love letters, half-eaten fruit, and the ghosts of so many women you can practically hear them whispering from the walls. Tonight, we aren't talking about brushstrokes or blue periods. Tonight, we're navigating the emotional labyrinth of Picasso's many muses, his polyamorous life painted in heartbreak, genius, and a constant hunger that no single person could ever satisfy. Picasso, by any metric, was a man who loved a lot. Not casually, not flippantly, but siffle, consuming his partners and companions as if their very essence would translate directly into pigment. His love wasn't delicate, it was feral, brilliant, dangerous. And while some of his relationships overlapped in time, all of them overlapped in intensity. He didn't cycle through women because he was bored. He cycled because he needed different things from each, emotionally, creatively, spiritually, physically. He didn't want a single mirror. He wanted a whole hall of them, each reflecting back a different angle of his own chaos. You find him in Chateau 4, still young, still poor, still tender around the edges. He meets Fernande Olivier, his first long-term muse and lover. She moves in, becomes the subject of dozens of early paintings, and bears witness to his transformation from struggling artist to cultural force. Their love is intense, almost sweet, but quickly erodes under the pressure of his rising fame and her craving for independence. Fernande wants stability. Picasso wants infinity. As their relationship cracks, he's already looking elsewhere. Then comes Eva Goul. Quieter, more delicate. A shift in tone. He paints her obsessively, sometimes as a form, sometimes as a code name. Ma jolie, he writes across the canvas. My pretty one. But she dies young, and something inside him shifts. From then on, his relationships take on a kind of emotional ricochet. He loves deeply, but also destructively. And the pattern begins. Now we fast forward to Olga Khokhlova, a Russian ballerina with aristocratic poise and a flair for discipline. She marries him, tries to build a traditional life. They have a son, Paolo. For a moment it almost works. Picasso paints tender portraits of Olga, explores classicism, flirts with convention. But soon he starts to chafe. Olga demands fidelity. Picasso's heart, however, is already elsewhere. Specifically, with a teenage Marie-Thérèse Walter, whom he meets outside a prison department store. She's 17, he's 45, and yes, pause here. That age gap is uncomfortable, disturbing even. Modern scholars don't shy away from it, nor should they. Picasso pursued women who were young, impressionable, often vulnerable, and while the relationships may have been consensual in a legal sense, the power imbalance was unmistakable. Marie-Thérèse, nonetheless, becomes a defining muse. Their relationship is sexual, joyful, and artistically explosive. She appears in his most sensuous work, curved lines, soft pastels, dreamlike intimacy. But even as he adores her, Picasso is incapable of monogamy. While she's bearing his child Maya, he's already drawing Dora Maar into his orbit. Dora is everything Marie-Thérèse isn't. Fierce, intellectual, traumatized, a surrealist photographer and resistance fighter who challenges Picasso emotionally and philosophically. Their relationship is tumultuous. He paints her crying, often always, not because she weeps, but because he wants her to. He later admits, rather chillingly, that he delighted in watching her unravel. And yet Dora stays for a time. She believes she is the one who understands him best. But of course she isn't the only one. Next is Françoise Gillot, perhaps the most independent of them all. She's young again, but smarter about power. She refuses to be destroyed by Picasso. They have 2 children, Claude and Paloma, and for a while she's the calm in the hurricane. But when he begins to pull away, she doesn't cling, she walks. She publishes Life with Picasso, a memoir that strips away the genius myth and reveals the moody, manipulative, narcissistic man beneath it. He never forgives her, which tells you everything you need to know. Then there's Jacqueline Roch. She becomes his second wife, his final muse. He paints her more than anyone else, over 400 portraits. Their love is intense but isolating. He becomes more possessive, more reclusive. And by the time of his death, Jacqueline is the gatekeeper to his legacy, his estate, his mythology. She protects him, even as he leaves behind a wake of broken hearts and furious descendants. Now the debate. Was Picasso a polyamorist or a serial monogamist with overlap and zero accountability? Some argue that his emotional bandwidth truly did extend to loving multiple people at once, but that he lacked the empathy or maturity to do so ethically. He rarely disclosed new affairs until the previous partner found out. He didn't negotiate openness, he simply took it. Others argue that Picasso's version of love was closer to addiction than intimacy, a compulsion to conquer, not to connect. But here's the complicated part. He did love them, all of them, differently. He kept photos and letters, remembered birthdays, wrote affectionate notes to past lovers long after the passion had faded. His love was real, just not sustainable, not safe, not fair. And in that murky zone between affection and possession, between polyamory and egoism, he created the work that would define his legacy. Here's your offbeat fact. Picasso once kept a literal muse list, an informal catalogue of women who had inspired various works. Not just romantic partners, but models, friends, even enemies. He saw people in fragments, nose, shoulder, hairline, and reconstructed them on canvas. Was this objectification? Yes, but also fascination. Reverence even, warped through obsession. You stand now in the empty studio. The light has shifted. It's quieter. You see the shadows of all those women, not as victims, or Harufi's, but as the mosaic of Picasso's emotional landscape. They were not interchangeable. They were unique, and in the space between their lives and his gaze, a kind of unintentional polyamory emerges, not healthy, not ethical, but undeniably real. So, was Picasso polyamorous? Not by design. But he did love many, often at the same time and deeply. It wasn't the kind of love you would want to be on the receiving end of, but it was love, tangled, raw, obsessive, a mess of portraits, poems, and broken hearts. And somehow, through all that wreckage, art. The pages creak as you open a leather-bound journal in a dim, smoky room lined with mirrors. You're in 930s Paris, but the light is low, the curtains drawn, and the perfume in the air is thick with suggestion. Across from you sits Anaïs Nin, typewriter beside her, a martini half sipped on the table, and a knowing smile curling at the edge of her lips. Her presence hums with the kind of quiet intensity that makes you second-guess your own thoughts. She speaks in metaphors, dances in memory, and records every emotional vibration like it's scripture. You're not here for fiction, though she wrote it. You're here for the diary, the real one, the one where love and desire multiply like reflections in a mirror, folding over themselves until it's impossible to tell where one person ends and another begins. Anaïs Nin's life is a masterclass in emotional layering. She didn't dabble in love, she immersed. Her partners weren't just people, they were lenses through which she explored herself, her writing, and her capacity for connection. Her most famous entanglements read like a literary scandal sheet. Henry Miller, June Miller, Otto Rank, Hugh Gieler, Rupert Pole, and several more orbiting the core like emotional moons, but calling them affairs sells it short. And this wasn't simply cheating. She was curating an entire constellation of lovers, each serving a different purpose, each held in place by her own gravitational charm. You first meet her with Henry Miller, the rugged, often broke, chronically intense writer whose grit contrasts with her dreamy introspection. Their relationship is electric, volatile, and utterly codependent. She supports him financially, critiques his work, writes beside him, sleeps with him, and sometimes, just as casually, sleeps with his wife. June Miller, Henry's estranged and intoxicating partner, fascinates Anaïs to the point of obsession. Their connection is spectral, almost hallucinatory. Anaïs writes about her like a ghost lover, present and absent, beautiful and broken. Whether they fully consummated their affair is still debated, but the emotional depth is unmistakable. Then comes Otto Rank, Freud's one-time protégé. Older, established, and dripping with therapeutic authority, he becomes her analyst, then her lover, then her conflicted idol. She writes pages and pages about the way his presence unspools her inattention, the way he holds her not like a possession, but like a puzzle. Their sessions blur into sex, and sex blurs into analysis. She says she feels stripped bare in every sense. It's not love as rescue, it's love as exposure. Meanwhile, back at home, her husband Hugo Guillet exists quietly in the background. He's kind, stable, financially comfortable, and, perhaps most significantly, not particularly curious. Anaïs hides her other relationships from him, not because she's ashamed, but because she knows Hugo doesn't want to see beyond the frame of their marriage. He lives in what Anaïs calls the illusion of monogamy. She doesn't lie maliciously, she lies beautifully, artfully, to preserve peace. It's not ethical polyamory, it's a performance, but a dedicated one. Here's your strange but true fact. For 11 years, Anaïs was married to 2 men simultaneously, Hugo in New York and Rupert Pole in California. She managed this double life with such precision that neither man knew about the other for nearly a decade. 2 homes, 2 wardrobes, 2 identities. In letters, she signed differently depending on who she was writing to. It sounds like a spy novel, but it was real. Until the IRS caught wind and forced her to annul one of the marriages to avoid bigamy charges, Rupert took the blow gently, still staying with her, still considering her his wife until the end of her life, because that's how deep the bonds ran. Even deception couldn't shake them. But it's not just the number of partners that makes Anaïs Nin's love life polyamorous, it's the way she thought about love itself. She saw desire as plural by nature. I want a multiple existence, as she wrote. I want to be with each one wholly and completely, because each one is a different flavour of me. Her lovers weren't simply partners, they were mirrors, stage lights, lenses through which she learned who she was and who she could be. She didn't fear contradiction, she embraced it. She lived inside it. Scholars continue to wrestle with her legacy. Was she a pioneer of sexual liberation, or a narcissist disguised as a poet? Was she a feminist hero or a problematic romantic playing too fast and loose with the truth? Some argue her polyamory was unethical, rooted in secrecy and avoidance. Others see her as a visionary, someone who lived before the language of ethical non-monogamy existed, yet instinctively understood that no single person could contain the full measure of her emotional world. She once wrote, "We travel, some of us forever, to seek other states, other lives, other souls." It's no surprise that her diaries, which span decades, feel like maps. Not linear maps, but just star charts. Every lover, every connection, a pinprick of light. She doesn't navigate toward a destination, she floats, orbits, sometimes collides. And always, she writes. Even in her old age, when illness made her physically fragile, Anaïs kept writing love letters, kept confessing her cravings, kept talking about touch and words and emotional resonance. She didn't cool with time. Her desire didn't shrink, it refined. You're sitting across from her now, and she leans forward, her eyes catching yours like hooks. People think love is linear, she says, but it isn't. It's spherical, and I'm always spinning. There's no bravado in her voice, just truth. Honest, complicated, and burning like candle wax over a page. So, was Anaïs Nin polyamorous? Undeniably. She may not have followed the ethical standards we use today, but she lived a life devoted to the idea that love is not a single line, it's a web. She loved recklessly, deeply, dishonestly, but also passionately and fully. She loved as many as she could reach. And in return, she gave us something equally sprawling, a diary that dares to say it out loud. The camera blinks to life in the hot pulse of 1960s New York City. Gritty sidewalks, neon flickers, sirens moaning in the distance like restless ghosts. You're walking into the factory, Andy Warhol's infamous creative playground, and it smells like silver spray paint, amphetamines, and ambition. Everything here is performance. Everything is art. And in the middle of it all is Warhol himself, pale and unmoving, like a wax figure trying to decide whether it's alive. But don't be fooled. Andy watches everything, records everything, and behind that flat expression and shy giggle lies a labyrinth of longing and complicated polyamorous attachment that no one, not even Andy, could completely untangle. Warhol never fit into any traditional shape. Not sexually, not romantically, not artistically. His relationships weren't about physicality. They were about presence, obsession, power, and most of all, inspiration. He collected people the way others collect rare vinyls, each one unique, each one displayed, cherished, used, and sometimes discarded. His lovers were often muses, his muses often lovers, and no one could ever be entirely sure where the lines were, or if there were any lines to begin with. Take Edie Sedgwick. She was the face of 1965, all eyeliner and cigarette smoke and damage barely tucked beneath designer sleeves. Andy dubbed her his superstar. They weren't lovers in the physical sense. Andy was famously asexual, at least according to most accounts, but their emotional intimacy was volcanic. He filmed her obsessively, cast her in role after role, dressed like her, acted like her, let her become him in drag. It wasn't romance, it wasn't friendship, it was something stranger, mutual possession. For a while they were inseparable, spinning in the same orbit. But Andy had other stars to chase, and Edie eventually burned out, her descent hastened by drugs and neglect. And then there was Paul Morrissey. Not a lover, but a collaborator who often clashed with Warhol, creative tensions mixed with veiled affection. Or Gerard Malanga, Warhol's assistant and sometimes model, who blurred the lines between work and worship. Warhol often maintained multiple intense emotional connections at once, but instead of calling them relationships, he called them projects. He wasn't sleeping with them, he was filming them, immortalizing them, loving them in his way. Yet he wasn't without romantic attachment. His longest sustained relationship was with Jed Johnson, an interior designer who began as a factory assistant and slowly became part of Warhol's domestic life. They lived together for over a decade, shared a dog, hosted dinner parties, almost, dare we say, normal. But even as Jed brought order to Warhol's chaos, Andy never abandoned his other attachments. He still kept muses around, still flirted with obsession, still vanished into the lives of others without warning. Their relationship, by many accounts, was polyamorous in function if not in declaration. Jed offered emotional grounding, while the factory remained Andy's endless buffet of emotional fascination. Here's your lesser-known detail. Warhol was obsessed with the idea of fame as intimacy. He believed that by watching someone closely, through a camera lens, through repetition, through slow, silent attention, you could love them more completely than through physical touch. He once said, "I like being in love with 3 people at the same time." Not because he wanted to be possessive, but because he believed love, like art, shouldn't be restricted by categories. He didn't need to sleep with someone to feel connected. He needed them in his frame. Of course, this created chaos. People felt used, forgotten, reduced to a role in a film or a piece of performance art. Some left angry, some self-destructed. Others stayed circling around him like moths who didn't mind the burn. Andy was never cruel in a classic sense. He wasn't malicious. But he could be emotionally indifferent. Polyamorous, perhaps, but not always kind about it. And still, he grieved. When Jed left him, citing emotional distance, Warhol was devastated. When Edie died, he was shaken, though he rarely said so aloud. When others accused him of being a vampire, of draining people for content, he shrugged it off publicly, but privately his diaries tell a different story. A man who wanted to be loved, who never believed he was, and who built a glittering, shattered empire out of the need to feel connected, without ever knowing quite how. This is where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was Warhol asexual, polyamorous, emotionally stunted, or just inventing a new form of human connection before the rest of us caught up? Some argue that his detachment was a trauma response rooted in years of illness, queer alienation, and deep-seated insecurities. Others insist he was simply wired differently, that he didn't crave bodies, he craved presences, and those presences, in turn, became the collage of his affection. Andy Warhol wasn't good at love, not in the traditional sense, but he was dedicated to it, ferociously, repetitively, recreating it on canvas, on film, in long silences, in fast edits. He believed that if he could just record something enough times, it might finally feel real. That maybe love wasn't about a single person loving you back, but about getting enough people to see you all at once and never forget you. Now you sit in the factory after hours, the paint has dried, the superstars have gone home or vanished into history. Andy's ghost lingers in a dusty corner, humming an unfinished Velvet Underground song and watching footage loop silently across the wall. The images flicker, Edie dancing, Jed laughing, someone crying in slow motion. It's not a love story, it's all of them. So, was Andy Warhol polyamorous? Not in the ways we typically define, but emotionally, aesthetically, maybe even spiritually, yes. He loved multitudes, simultaneously, strangely, often saliently. He loved through art, through image, through repetition. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for him. The train groans into Zurich, and you step off into the early 20th century like you're arriving at a crossroads, not just of cities or philosophies, but of minds. Everything around you feels slightly askew, as if logic itself took a detour somewhere back in Vienna. You're here to enter the world of Carl Jung, and trust me, things are about to get psychologically layered. This isn't a love story in any traditional sense. It's more of an emotional constellation where dreams, symbols, and shadow selves collide, and at the centre of it is Jung, peering into your soul like it's a locked drawer he's itching to pick open. But tonight, we're not here for just archetypes and anima. We're here to examine his quietly radical, spiritually charged, and deeply unconventional polyamorous entanglement with not one but two women who knew exactly how tangled he really was. Jung's marriage to Emma Rauschenbach begins like many partnerships of the time, with status, intellect, and the mutual understanding that she'll support his career while raising their children and holding down the domestic front. Emma isn't just a wife. She's independently wealthy, whip-smart, and probably more psychologically equipped than most to deal with a man who literally spends his life exploring the unconscious. They have 5 children, she edits his work, she helps manage his clinic. By all outward appearances, she's the anchor in his cerebral hurricane. But then comes Toni Woolf. Toni starts as a patient, she's dealing with grief and depression after her father's death, and she ends up under Jung's care. But quickly something shifts. She's not just receptive, she's brilliant. She devours mythology, philosophy, dream theory. She becomes his intellectual match, then his collaborator, and finally, yes, his lover. All of this happens while he remains married to Emma. And here's where things stop being salacious and start being, let's say, experimental. Jung doesn't hide Toni from Emma. In fact, he eventually tells her outright, and the 2 women settle, after much emotional labour, into a strange, unspoken arrangement. Toni becomes what Jung later calls his second wife in spirit. She doesn't live in the house, but she's a constant presence. She and Jung work together daily, diving into the deep waters of the psyche, analysing symbols, exchanging dreams like love letters. Emma, meanwhile, remains his official partner, the mother of his children, the keeper of his history. You watch this unfold not like a soap opera, but like a living thesis on the complexity of love. It's not romantic in the candlelit sense. It's messy, slow-burning, full of negotiations that no one ever fully explains. Jung isn't exactly honest, but he's not hiding either. He genuinely loves both women, differently, deeply. Emma represents earth, spolombo, rooted, loyal. Toni is fire, intuitive, mystical, challenging. Jung doesn't choose, he refuses to choose. Here's your fringe historical fact. Emma and Toni never become friends, but they do coexist, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising grace. There are dinners, there are joint appearances, there's even a record of the 3 of them attending professional functions together. A quiet acknowledgement of a non-traditional triad that defied the mores of Swiss society. They didn't call it polyamory, of course. They barely called it anything, but it was real, and it lasted decades. Jung believed in something he called psychic polarity, the idea that every human being contains opposing forces, and that the healthiest relationships help integrate those tensions. In his own life, he seemed to live that out with Emma and Toni. One woman embodied conscious loyalty, the other, the mystery of the unconscious. He saw their coexistence not as moral failure, but as symbolic harmony. Yes, it's convenient to frame it that way where especially for a man surrounded by women doing the emotional heavy lifting. But still, he built a life where both loves were allowed to exist, and more importantly, evolve. There's a scholarly debate here that still simmers. Was Jung ethically non-monogamous, or did he simply intellectualize his infidelity into something palatable? Some argue that he manipulated his psychological framework to justify what would otherwise be called a long-term affair. Others counter that his arrangement was revolutionary for its time, especially given that all parties were educated, autonomous, and deeply involved in one another's lives. Whatever your stance, it's hard to deny the emotional honesty behind it. Jung wasn't pretending to be one thing while doing another. He was saying out loud, "I love both of you, and I don't believe I have to deny one to keep the other." As the years pass, the dynamic endures. Emma eventually passes away in 55 after decades of marriage and quiet endurance. Jung is devastated. Not long after, Toni too begins to withdraw, her health declining. She dies in 1953 before Emma, but never once left Jung's inner circle. Her influence on his work is so profound that many historians now argue she co-authored some of his key theories, particularly around the anima archetype and the feminine unconscious. She wasn't just a lover, she was an architect of his legacy. And here's the part that stings a little. Toni's name appears in fewer books than she deserves. Emma is remembered as the devoted wife. Jung remains the towering figure, Frida. But Toni? She lives in footnotes, in fragments of letters, in dream interpretations and half-sighted quotes. Yet without her, the very architecture of Jung's mythology would be incomplete. She wasn't just his muse, she was his mirror. You're in his study now, years after both women have passed. Jung is older, quieter, still dreaming, still writing. He sits by the fire and flips through a journal. On the mantel are two photographs, one of Emma, one of Toni. He looks at them like someone trying to reconcile past lives into one final chapter. Maybe he still doesn't know how to explain what they were to him. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some loves aren't meant to be defined, only acknowledged. So was Carl Jung polyamorous? Quietly, yes, not in the modern community blog kind of way. But in his own layered, psychological way, he lived a dual devotion with surprising transparency. He loved both women, honoured both women, while weaving them into his theories, his home and his mind. And through that, he left us not just a new way to think about the psyche, but a new way to think about love itself. The motor purrs beneath your feet as you glide up the California coast in a cherry-red convertible. The sun flickering off the Pacific and your hair whipping wildly in the wind. You're heading toward Big Sur, chasing something slippery, freedom maybe, or a person who practically turned freedom into a religion. His name is Neal Cassady, and if you're imagining a man whose life was one long, manic love letter to movement, sex, and chaos, you're already halfway there. Tonight's chapter doesn't sit still, it doesn't settle down, because Neal, the legendary muse behind Jack Kerouac's On the Road, lived a life of overlapping passion, reckless entanglements, and a brand of polyamory that didn't just break rules, it forgot they even existed in the first place. You spot him now at the edge of a beat-up diner somewhere in the late 1940s, chain-smoking and telling a story so fast he forgets to breathe. He's got that wild-eyed charisma that draws people in like a magnet wrapped in a grin. Cassady wasn't classically educated, but he knew how to make words jump. He talked in jazz rhythms, thought in stream-of-consciousness bursts, and loved with a kind of speed that left most people breathless, literally and emotionally. And man, did he love. At the centre of this hurricane of desire was Caroline Cassady, his wife and at times his unwilling anchor. She was sharp, artistic, and determined to carve a conventional life out of the madness Neal brought to her door. They had children, a home, bills, but Neal wasn't built for domesticity. Even when he was home, he wasn't home. He was writing letters to Allen Ginsberg, sleeping with half the Beat Generation, disappearing for days, showing up with new lovers and new philosophies. And somehow through it all, Caroline stayed. For a while. The truth is, Neal loved Caroline, and Allen, and countless others, simultaneously, passionately, often dishonestly. But the emotions were real. His letters to Ginsberg are full of raw vulnerability and tangled sexuality. Ginsberg, in turn, was madly in love with Neal, sometimes reciprocated, sometimes not. Their relationship spanned decades, fueled by poetry, sex, jealousy, and the kind of emotional dependency that doesn't always look like love, but feels exactly like it. Meanwhile, Kerouac looms like a jealous ghost in the background, obsessed with Neal, trying to understand him, trying to be him. In On the Road, Neal becomes Dean Moriarty, the heart of the American countercultural myth. And part of that myth is his polyamorous soul, married to one woman, fathering children with another, having sex with men and women in a blur of fast cars and faster talk. It wasn't about conquest, it wasn't about rebellion, it was about aliveness. That's the word Neal returned to over and over again. He didn't want to be happy, he wanted to be alive. Here's your offbeat fact. Cassady once kept a detailed chart of all the women he'd slept with, rating the encounters not for quality or bragging rights, but to try to understand himself better. It wasn't ego, it was almost scientific in that deeply unscientific beat way. He wasn't trying to exploit. He was trying to feel. He wanted every experience to echo, to ripple, to somehow prove that he was connected to the universe by more than just flesh. But let's be honest, Neal was not an ethical polyamorist, not even close. He lied constantly. He hurt people, ghosted people, emotionally manipulated those who loved him. Carolyn was devastated by his constant betrayals. Ginsberg was tormented by his refusal to settle into something more stable. Many of his lovers felt used, discarded when the thrill wore off. Neal was addicted to the start of things, the spark, the rush, the newness. He never quite figured out how to live with the steady burn of sustained intimacy. And yet the love was real. All of it. Neal cried over Carolyn's letters when they were separated. He wrote long, meandering, borderline poetic confessions to Alan. He once walked miles to see a woman he barely knew, just because she'd said something that reminded him of a feeling he hadn't felt since childhood. He felt too much. That was the real problem. Scholars still fight over what Neal represented. Was he the poster child for mid-century hedonism, or a proto-poly icon who simply lacked the language and structure to live his truth responsibly? Some view him as a tragic figure, a man bursting with love but cursed by instability. Others dismiss him as narcissistic, an emotional tornado who justified bad behaviour by calling it freedom. But either way, no one forgets him. The emotional wake he left behind was wide, messy and unforgettable. Even Carolyn, after everything, continued to defend him. She wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and tried to explain his madness with grace. She said Neal was born without brakes, that he didn't mean to hurt anyone, that he just couldn't stop moving, and that more than anything, he needed love like oxygen, but only in short, ecstatic breaths. Not the kind you settle down into. You see him now, much older, still chasing something down the freeway of his mind. He died young, at 41, under vague and shadowy circumstances in Mexico. Drugs were involved, so were secrets, but even in his final days he was writing letters, reconnecting with old flames, dreaming up new beginnings, the same way he always had. So was Neal Cassady polyamorous? Emotionally, absolutely, functionally, barely, ethically, not even close. But his life stands as a chaotic monument to what it looks like when love is infinite, but discipline is not. He wasn't trying to be a model for anyone. He was just trying to feel the world more fully than most people dare. And for better or worse, he did. The desert spreads out before you like a cracked canvas, dry and endless under a blinding New Mexico sky. You're in Los Alamos now, land of dust, classified secrets, and men playing God with uranium. But tonight you're not here for the mushroom cloud. You're here for the man behind it, J. Robert Oppenheimer, genius physicist, reluctant harbinger of apocalypse. And beneath all that Cold War mythology and chain-smoking existential dread, a tangled, emotionally charged love life that wove through marriages, affairs, ideological obsessions, and a quiet but persistent thread of polyamorous impulse he never quite dared name. He split the atom. He almost split the world. But what he never managed to split cleanly was his own heart. You find him in the 1930s first, striding through Berkeley's campus in a tweed coat and philosophical gloom, his head always a few beats ahead of the conversation. That's where he meets Jean Tatlock. She's a Stanford medical student, fiercely intelligent, politically left, and stunning in that deeply intense, war-haunted way that makes everything feel like a Hemingway novel. Their connection is immediate and complicated. Jean is passionate, depressive, possibly queer, and absolutely uninterested in conventional expectations. Oppenheimer is fascinated not just by her, but by the energy she represents. Emotional honesty, intellectual freedom, the kind of love that doesn't obey containment protocols. They begin an on and off relationship that defies easy labels. Oppenheimer proposes at one point. Jean declines, not because she doesn't love him, she does, but because she knows herself too well. She once told a friend she couldn't be anyone's wife and meant it. Still, they remain entangled for years, emotionally, physically, ideologically. Even after he marries someone else, Jean continues to orbit his life like a dark star, never distant enough to forget, never close enough to claim. Then comes Kitty Puning, his eventual wife. Kitty is her own storm. Brilliant, prickly, already married when they meet. She leaves her husband to be with Robert, pregnant with Oppenheimer's child, fiercely determined to carve space in his life that won't dissolve into ashes. And for a time, she succeeds. They marry, move into a New Mexico ranch called Perro Caliente. She gardens, he rides horses, they drink too much and argue more. But beneath the domestic image is something more complex, a marriage built not on fidelity, but on a kind of cold realism. Kitty knows about Jean, suspects others, doesn't particularly like it, but tolerates it, because Robert Oppenheimer doesn't belong to anyone, not really. And here's your strange but true historical footnote. While he was directing the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer was under constant surveillance, not just for his politics, but for his romantic entanglements. Jean Tatlock, by then a known communist, was still part of his life. He visited her in 1943, shortly before her tragic death by apparent suicide. Officially, it was just a stopover. Unofficially, it was an emotional earthquake. He never got over it. Some say he never really tried. Meanwhile, whispers of other women follow him. Secretaries, colleagues, even possibly men, though those rumours are buried deeper. What we do know is that Oppenheimer had the emotional capacity to love more than one person at a time, and he did, not always well, not always ethically, but with the same intensity he applied to everything else. His mind ran fast and his heart didn't lag far behind. There's a particularly haunting moment in his FBI file, a record of his interrogations during the post-war Red Scare. They asked him about Jean, about his visits, about whether he was hiding anything. And what's chilling isn't just the scrutiny, it's how he tried to explain her. She was a very important part of my life, he said. Not was my lover, not was my friend, but something vaguer, deeper, a person who couldn't be categorized but also couldn't be dismissed. This is where the polyamorous thread begins to solidify, not in declarations, but in the structure of his life. He stayed married to Kitty, even as their intimacy eroded. He carried Jean's memory like a wound. He formed deep, affectionate bonds with other women, and possibly men, through letters, shared ideals, and quiet companionship. He wasn't collecting lovers. He was sustaining emotional connections across multiple axes. Some scholars argue he maintained what we might now call parallel emotional relationships, ones that didn't always involve sex, but did involve profound, sustained devotion. The debate among historians is sharp. Was Oppenheimer emotionally polyamorous, or just a brilliant man incapable of full commitment? Was he too fractured to love fully, or too full to love only one person? His letters suggest someone who wanted to be faithful, but didn't believe fidelity had to mean singularity. He once wrote that the way we love is the way we think. For him, that meant complexity, ambiguity, a refusal to draw hard lines around emotions that never obeyed them. Here's your quirky fringe detail. In his later years, Oppenheimer became obsessed with Hindu philosophy, not just the famous Bhagavad Gita quote about becoming death, but the deeper spiritual tenets, detachment, multiplicity, the idea that love, like energy, can exist in many forms without being diminished. He once compared emotional connection to wave-particle duality, both constant and shifting, both fixed and infinite. You can almost hear the gears turning, a physicist trying to chart the heart like a quantum equation. You find him at the end of his life, sitting in the dusk on his porch in the Virgin Islands, a glass in hand, a soft wind ruffling what's left of his hair. He doesn't speak much now, but his eyes are still sharp. Kitty is nearby, distant but present. He still thinks of Jean, of the lives he changed, the hearts he held, the cities he burned into ash. His life was not one of resolution, but of collision, not of answers, but of ongoing equations. So was J. Robert Oppenheimer polyamorous? Quietly, almost certainly. Not by label, not by manifesto, but by nature, by behaviour, by the simple aching truth that he loved more than one person, deeply and simultaneously, and never stopped. And in that haunting mix of guilt, memory, and brilliance, he gave us not just a bomb, but a reminder of how fragile and expansive the human heart can be. You're standing now in a vast hall of echoes, the kind that doesn't need walls or ceilings because it exists entirely in memory. All around you are the voices we've followed tonight: Baldwin whispering in a Paris cafe, Cleopatra reclining in scented smoke, Woolf scribbling beside a fireplace, Cassady yelling over jazz in a dive bar. You've travelled through centuries and languages, across empires and bedrooms, and what lingers isn't scandal, it's sincerity. It's the strange, fragile truth that genius and polyamory have always made uneasy, beautiful bedfellows. You probably came here expecting a little gossip, some steamy backstories about brilliant minds loving wildly and recklessly, and sure, we delivered. But what you may not have expected is how familiar it all feels, how the greatest thinkers, artists and leaders were, deep down, just trying to figure out what so many of us still are: how to love more than one person without loving anyone less. Polyamory isn't a new experiment. It's an old human tendency, one history tried to redact. These were not side stories, they were central. These connections shaped theories, launched novels, inspired paintings, and tore through political revolutions. They weren't always ethical, they weren't always gentle, but they were real. People loved imperfectly, simultaneously, with contradiction and courage, and out of that came some of the most profound art and science the world has ever seen. You've seen the hidden maps, the muses who didn't fit the official narrative, the spouses who shared their homes with ghosts of past lovers, the friendships that bloomed into something undefinable and stayed that way on purpose. Genius minds, it turns out, don't just bend the rules of their fields, they bend the rules of love too. And maybe that's the takeaway. Not that you should rush out and start dating 5 people at once just to feel brilliant. But that love, like thought, rarely works best when it's boxed in. And the more we allow for complexity, honesty, and a little chaos, the closer we get to something that lasts. So whether you're monogamous, poly, solo, undefined, or just figuring it out as you go, you're in excellent company.